Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Kenneth Young, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness in central Idaho, about 40 miles northeast of McCall, near the middle fork of the Salmon River. I'd been planning this trip for months, a week-long solo camping expedition with my German Shepherd, Rex. After my divorce finalized and I lost the house, I needed to get away from everything. The wilderness seemed like the perfect escape from the suffocating weight of my crumbling life. Rex was all I had left, really. Sarah had tried to take him in the settlement, but even her lawyer knew that was a losing battle. Rex had been mine since he was 8 weeks old. The drive up Forest Service Road 347 took 3 hours of increasingly rough terrain. My Subaru Forester groaned over the washboard surface, and by the time I reached the trailhead at Boundary Creek, I hadn't seen another vehicle for 90 minutes. Perfect. The isolation was exactly what I needed. Rex bounded out of the car the moment I opened the door, immediately investigating every scent within a 50-foot radius. His enthusiasm was infectious, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something resembling hope. The late September air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine needles and the promise of an early winter. According to my GPS, the nearest town was over 100 miles away through some of the most rugged terrain in the lower 48. I shouldered my pack, 42 pounds of gear for 7 days, and studied my topographic map one last time. My planned route would take me along Boundary Creek for about 12 miles, then up through Bear Valley to a series of alpine lakes where I'd make base camp. The trail was marked as primitive and maintained infrequently, which was exactly what I wanted. No crowds, no weekend warriors, no cell service, just me, Rex, and the kind of silence you can only find in true wilderness. The first 3 hours of hiking were blissful. Rex trotted ahead on the narrow trail, occasionally circling back to check on me or investigate something interesting in the underbrush. The path wound through dense stands of Douglas fir and ponderosa pine, with occasional clearings that offered glimpses of the jagged peaks ahead. By late afternoon, we'd covered about 8 miles, and I was feeling the weight of the pack, but in a good way, the kind of honest fatigue that comes from physical exertion rather than emotional exhaustion. As the sun began to sink behind the western ridgeline, I started looking for a suitable campsite. The trail had been climbing steadily for the past hour, and I wanted to stop before full darkness set in. I found a relatively flat spot about 50 yards off the trail, near a small creek that would provide fresh water. Rex immediately began his own site inspection, marking territory and checking perimeters with the efficiency of a seasoned outdoorsman. Setting up camp was routine. I'd done it hundreds of times before. Tent first, then sleeping system, bear canister hung properly, and finally a small fire. Rex settled onto his travel blanket and watched me work, his intelligent brown eyes tracking every movement. As darkness crept in from the tree line, I felt that familiar camping alone anxiety begin to creep up my spine. It happened every trip, that moment when the night sounds started and you realized how completely alone you were. But tonight felt different, wrong somehow. It started with Rex. As I was heating water for my dehydrated dinner, he suddenly lifted his head from his paws and stared into the darkness beyond our small circle of firelight. His ears were forward, alert, and a low growl rumbled deep in his chest. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, following his gaze. The darkness beyond our camp was absolute, thick, impenetrable blackness that seemed to swallow the weak light from our fire. I listened intently but heard only the normal night sounds. Wind through the pines, the distant creek, the occasional snap of cooling wood. Rex continued to stare for another minute, then gradually relaxed, though he remained more alert than usual. I tried to shake off the unease as I ate my reconstituted beef stroganoff, but the feeling persisted. There was something about the quality of the darkness that felt different from any wilderness night I'd experienced. It seemed heavier, more present, as if it were actively pressing against the boundaries of our firelight rather than simply being the absence of illumination. Around 10 o'clock, I banked the fire and retired to my tent. Rex settled just outside the entrance, as was his custom. I'd brought a paperback novel, but found myself unable to concentrate on the words. Every small sound seemed amplified. The rustle of my sleeping bag, the whisper of wind against the tent fly, my own breathing. I was just beginning to drift off when Rex started growling again. This time, it was different. Not the alert attention of earlier, but a deep, continuous rumble that spoke of real threat. I unzipped the tent entrance and peered out. Rex was standing rigid, every muscle tense, staring into the forest. The growling stopped as soon as he sensed me behind him, but he didn't relax. "Rex, what's out there?" He glanced back at me briefly, then returned his attention to the darkness. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the tree line. Nothing. Just pine trunks and shadows and the faint reflection of animal eyes that vanished the moment the light touched them. Normal forest eyes, probably deer or elk. But Rex wasn't convinced. He remained on guard for another hour before finally settling down, though I noticed he positioned himself directly between me and whatever had caught his attention. I slept poorly, waking multiple times to check on Rex and listen to the night sounds. Each time, everything seemed normal, but there was an underlying wrongness I couldn't shake. It was like trying to remember a word that stays just beyond reach, something important hovering at the edge of perception. Morning brought relief and embarrassment in equal measure. In daylight, the forest looked benign and welcoming, full of birdsong and dappled sunlight. Rex was back to his normal self, eager for breakfast and the day's adventure. I packed quickly, eager to put distance between us and whatever had spooked both of us during the night. The second day's hike took us deeper into the wilderness, climbing through Bear Valley toward the Alpine Zone. The trail was even more primitive here, sometimes disappearing entirely for hundreds of yards before reappearing around a bend or across a meadow. Rex seemed to enjoy the challenge of route finding, often alerting me to where the trail resumed after I'd lost it. By afternoon, we reached my intended destination, a series of 3 small lakes nestled in a cirque below a granite headwall. The largest lake was perhaps 100 yards across, its surface a perfect mirror reflecting the surrounding peaks. It was breathtakingly beautiful and utterly isolated. According to my map, the nearest maintained trail was 15 miles away. I set up camp on a flat bench above the largest lake, with a commanding view of the entire basin. Rex explored the area thoroughly while I worked, eventually settling on a sun-warmed boulder where he could keep watch over our domain. The afternoon was peaceful, almost hypnotically so. I caught 3 small brook trout for dinner and spent the evening reading by the fire, feeling more relaxed than I had in months. But as darkness fell, that wrongness returned. It started subtly. Rex became restless, unable to settle in his usual spot. He'd lie down for a few minutes, then get up and move to a different position, always maintaining vigilance over different approaches to our camp. By the time I went to bed, he'd changed positions at least a dozen times. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of Rex whimpering. Not the alert growl of the previous night, but the confused, almost pleading whimper of a dog in distress. I found him standing at the edge of camp, staring up at the head wall above us. His entire body was trembling. I followed his gaze but saw nothing except the faint outline of the cliffs against the starlit sky. But there was something else. A sound, barely audible, that seemed to be coming from somewhere up among the rocks. At first I thought it might be wind, but the air was completely still. Then I realized what I was hearing. Someone calling my name. Kenneth. Kenneth. The voice was faint and distorted, seeming to echo off the granite walls in ways that made it impossible to pinpoint the source. But it was definitely my name, spoken in a tone that was somehow familiar, yet completely wrong. like hearing your own voice played back on a recording that had been slightly damaged. Rex pressed against my legs, still trembling. I'd never seen him like this, not just alert or defensive, but genuinely afraid. And hearing my name called in this isolated place, where no one else should be for dozens of miles, sent ice water through my veins. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding thin and uncertain in the vast darkness. "Is someone there?" The calling stopped immediately, as if my response had killed it mid-syllable. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the voice had been, a complete absence of sound that felt unnatural in a living forest. Even the normal night sounds had stopped. No insects, no wind, no water lapping at the lake shore. Just perfect, empty silence. Rex and I stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, waiting for something to happen. When the normal sounds gradually returned, Rex finally stopped trembling, though he remained tense and watchful. Neither of us slept much for the rest of the night. Morning brought another reprieve, and I tried to convince myself that I'd imagined the voice. Maybe it was wind after all, or the sound of rockfall in the distance that my tired brain had interpreted as words. But Rex's reaction had been too pronounced to dismiss easily. Dogs knew things humans didn't. I spent the third day exploring the upper lake and the surrounding cirque, partly for pleasure and partly to work off the nervous energy from the past 2 nights. Rex stayed close, which was unusual for him. Normally, he'd range widely while I hiked, investigating every interesting scent and sound. Today, he rarely moved more than 20 feet from my side. The upper lake was smaller and perfectly round, fed by a waterfall that cascaded down from the head wall. As I sat on the shore eating lunch, I noticed something odd about the water. Despite the bright sunshine, I couldn't see the bottom of the lake, even close to shore where it should have been visible. The water was clear but seemed to absorb light rather than transmit it, creating an impression of infinite depth. Rex refused to drink from this lake, even though he was clearly thirsty after the morning's hike. Instead, he waited until we returned to the lower lake, then drank deeply from its clear, normal-looking water. His instincts were obviously better than mine. That evening, I made the mistake of building my fire larger than usual, partly for the extra light and partly for the comfort. The flames cast dancing shadows across the surrounding trees and rocks, creating a constantly shifting landscape of light and darkness that made me increasingly paranoid. Every moving shadow looked like something trying to approach the camp. Rex was agitated again, but differently than before. Instead of staring into the darkness, he kept looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not quite fear, but something like confusion or concern. He'd whine softly, approach me as if to communicate something important, then retreat to his guard position when I couldn't understand what he wanted. Around 11 o'clock, he suddenly bolted into the darkness. I called after him, but he was gone, swallowed by the night as completely as if he'd never existed. Rex had never done anything like this before. He was trained, disciplined, and absolutely devoted to staying close during camping trips. For him to run off into unknown wilderness was completely out of character. I waited by the fire for over an hour, calling his name and listening for any sound of his return. The silence was profound and unsettling. Finally, I banked the fire and went to my tent, leaving the entrance partially unzipped so I'd hear him when he came back. I woke before dawn to the sound of Rex outside my tent. Relief flooded through me as I heard his familiar breathing and movement. But something was wrong with the sound. The rhythm was off somehow, too measured and deliberate for natural canine breathing. "Rex?" I called softly. "You okay, boy?" No response, but the breathing continued. I unzipped the tent entrance and looked out. Rex was sitting about 10 feet away, perfectly still, facing me. In the dim, pre-dawn light, his silhouette looked normal, but there was something wrong with his posture. Too rigid, too perfectly balanced. And his eyes, even in the poor light, I could see that his eyes were reflecting the dying embers of the fire with an intensity that seemed unnatural. "Rex, come here." He didn't move, didn't wag his tail or show any sign of recognition. Just sat there, motionless, staring at me with those unnaturally bright eyes. I reached for my flashlight and switched it on. The beam illuminated Rex's familiar form: gray and black coat, pointed ears, intelligent face. But the details were wrong. His coat was too clean, too perfectly groomed for a dog that had just spent hours running through the wilderness. His posture was too human, too conscious. And his eyes, which should have shown the typical eye-shine of reflected light, instead seemed to glow with their own internal illumination. "Rex!" My voice came out as a whisper. The thing that looked like Rex tilted its head slightly, and for one horrible moment I thought it was going to speak. Instead, it smiled. Not the panting, tongue-lolling expression of a happy dog, but an unmistakably human smile. Lips pulled back to reveal too many teeth, all perfectly white and sharp. I scrambled backward into my tent, zipping the entrance closed with shaking hands. Through the thin nylon I could hear movement outside, not the familiar sounds of Rex settling down for the night, but something else. Careful, deliberate movement that circled the tent slowly, as if examining it from every angle. The movement stopped directly outside the tent's entrance. I could hear breathing again, but now it was definitely wrong. Too slow, too deep, with an odd whistling quality on the exhale. Something touched the tent wall near my head, pressing the fabric inward with what felt like fingertips rather than paws. I don't know how long I lay there, frozen with terror, listening to the thing outside my tent. Eventually, the sounds stopped and I must have dozed, because I woke to full daylight and the normal sounds of morning. Birds, wind, water. I unzipped the tent cautiously and looked out. Nothing. No sign of Rex or the thing that had worn his appearance. The ground around my tent showed no footprints or paw prints, despite the soft earth that should have retained clear impressions. I packed quickly, my hands shaking as I stuffed gear into my backpack. I needed to get out of this place, to reach the trailhead in my car and the safety of civilization. But as I shouldered my pack and started toward the trail, I heard a familiar bark from the forest above me. Rex emerged from the trees, tail wagging, looking perfectly normal. He bounded toward me with obvious joy at our reunion, showing no sign of his nighttime absence or whatever had impersonated him. Every detail was correct. The small scar on his left ear from a puppy accident, the way he carried his head slightly cocked when excited, the particular pattern of markings on his chest. But I couldn't shake the memory of those glowing eyes and that terrible human smile. "Where were you, boy?" I asked, keeping my voice steady with effort. Rex responded with his usual enthusiasm, jumping up to put his paws on my chest and trying to lick my face. His behavior was completely normal, but I found myself studying him for any sign that this wasn't really my dog. The hike down from the Alpine Lakes should have taken 3 hours. It took me 5 because I kept stopping to look over my shoulder and check on Rex. He trotted ahead on the trail just as he had on the way up, but now, every time he moved out of sight around a bend, I felt a spike of panic that what came back wouldn't really be him. By late afternoon, we'd descended back into the forest zone, and I was beginning to feel like maybe the worst was behind us. The dark, oppressive atmosphere of the high country had given way to normal woodland sounds and smells. Rex seemed completely himself, investigating scents and chasing the occasional squirrel with his usual canine enthusiasm. But as evening approached and I started looking for a campsite, I realized we'd been walking much longer than we should have. According to my GPS, we should have reached the junction with the main trail hours ago. Instead, the device showed us in an area that didn't match my topographic map, a broad valley that shouldn't exist according to the contour lines I'd studied so carefully before the trip. I stopped and spread the map on a fallen log, trying to correlate what I was seeing with what should be there. Rex sat beside me, panting slightly, and I found myself studying his face again for any sign that this wasn't really my dog. But every detail was perfect, even the way he cocked his head when he sensed my anxiety. The map made no sense. According to the GPS coordinates, we were somehow 15 miles northeast of where we should be, in an area marked as a roadless wilderness with no trails at all. But we'd been following what appeared to be a well-used path all day, clear and obvious despite the primitive marking on my map. As I wrestled with this impossibility, Rex suddenly stood up and stared into the forest. His ears were forward and alert, but he wasn't growling or showing any signs of distress. Instead, his tail began to wag slowly, the way it did when he recognized someone approaching. "Kenneth! Kenneth, is that you?" The voice came from somewhere ahead of us on the trail, a woman's voice calling with the relieved tone of someone who'd been searching. But hearing any human voice in this isolated area sent chills down my spine. We were supposed to be alone out here, dozens of miles from the nearest person. "Hello," I called back, my hand moving instinctively to the bear spray on my belt. "Oh, thank God! I've been looking for you." A figure emerged from the trees ahead, a woman in her 30s, wearing hiking gear that looked expensive and well-maintained. She was attractive in a wholesome, outdoorsy way, with shoulder-length brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Everything about her appearance suggested an experienced hiker, but something felt wrong about the encounter. "I'm sorry," I said, "but I don't think we've met. Are you lost?" She stopped about 20 feet away, close enough to talk comfortably but far enough that I could react if needed. Rex watched her with interest but no apparent alarm. "You don't remember me?" she asked, tilting her head with an expression of confusion and hurt. "Kenneth, it's me, Sarah." The name hit me like a physical blow. Sarah was my ex-wife, but this woman looked nothing like her. Sarah was blonde and petite, with pale skin that burned easily in the sun. This woman was taller, darker, more athletic. The only similarity was the name and a certain quality around the eyes that seemed familiar. "You're not Sarah," I said, backing away slowly. "Sarah is..." "Different?" the woman interrupted. "Changed?" "Kenneth, I've been trying to find you for days. I've been so worried." She took a step forward, and I noticed that despite her expensive gear and healthy appearance, she cast no shadow on the trail. The late afternoon sun was hitting her directly, but the ground beneath her feet showed no interruption in the pattern of light and shadow. Rex began to growl, a low rumble that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his chest. The woman's expression shifted slightly, becoming less concerned and more predatory. "Your dog doesn't seem happy to see me," she said, and her voice had changed too, still female but with an odd harmonic quality, as if multiple voices were speaking in perfect unison. "Stay back," I warned, pulling out the bear spray and removing the safety clip. She laughed, and the sound was like wind through dead leaves. "Kenneth, you're being ridiculous. Don't you recognize your own wife?" But she was changing as she spoke. Her features shifted subtly, becoming more familiar yet more wrong with each passing second. The brown hair lightened to blonde, the face narrowed and softened, the body became smaller and more delicate. Within moments, she looked exactly like Sarah. Not similar, but identical down to the small mole on her left cheek and the way she favored her right leg from an old skiing injury. "See?" she said in Sarah's voice with Sarah's mannerisms and inflections. "It's me, honey. I came to bring you home." Rex's growling intensified, and he moved to position himself between me and the thing that looked like my ex-wife. But I was transfixed by the perfect mimicry. The way it had captured not just Sarah's appearance but her expressions, her vocal patterns, even the slight asymmetry in her smile that I'd found so endearing during our marriage. "You're dead," I whispered. It wasn't true. Sarah was very much alive, probably at her new boyfriend's house in Portland, but it was the only thing my shocked brain could produce. The Sarah thing's expression didn't change, but its eyes began to glow with the same unnatural light I'd seen in the thing that had worn Rex's form. Death is just another country, Kenneth, and I've learned to cross borders. It started toward me, moving with Sarah's familiar gait, but somehow wrong, as if it were consciously mimicking movements rather than performing them naturally. Rex barked once, sharp and warning, then launched himself at the creature. What happened next defied every law of physics I understood. Rex passed through the thing as if it were made of smoke, landing hard on the trail and scrambling to regain his footing. The Sarah thing laughed again, that wind-through-leaves sound, and its form began to shimmer and shift. "Your turn, Kenneth," it said, and its voice was changing too, becoming deeper, more resonant. "Your turn to cross borders." I turned and ran. Behind me, I could hear Rex barking frantically, but the sound seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once, as if there were several dogs, or as if the sound itself were being twisted by the landscape. I didn't look back, just plunged into the forest off the trail, crashing through underbrush and low branches in my desperation to escape. The forest around me seemed to shift and change as I ran. Trees that should have been familiar became alien, their bark taking on textures and patterns I'd never seen before. The light filtering through the canopy had a greenish quality that made everything look underwater. And behind me, always behind me, I could hear pursuit. Not footsteps, but something that sounded like wind or water or whispered voices. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out, then forced myself to keep running. When I finally collapsed behind a massive Douglas fir, gasping for breath, the forest around me was completely silent. No pursuit sounds, no Rex barking, no normal forest noise at all. Just the ragged sound of my own breathing and the hammer of my heart. I waited there for what felt like hours, afraid to move or make any sound that might give away my position. Gradually, normal forest sounds returned. Wind in the branches, the distant call of a jay, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But no sign of Rex or the thing that had worn Sarah's face. When I finally worked up the courage to move, I found myself in completely unfamiliar territory. The massive trees and dense undergrowth bore no resemblance to the area where I'd been camping. According to my GPS, I was somehow 30 miles south of my previous position, in an area the device marked as unmapped territory. I spent that night huddled against a tree, afraid to sleep and afraid to build a fire that might attract unwanted attention. Every sound in the darkness made me freeze with terror. Not just the fear of wild animals, but the deeper dread of encountering something that wasn't quite what it appeared to be. Rex found me at dawn. He emerged from the forest looking exhausted and bedraggled, but unmistakably himself. His relief at finding me was palpable. He whined and pressed against me and wouldn't leave my side as I struggled to my feet. I wanted to trust that this was really my dog, but after the previous day's encounters, I found myself studying every detail of his appearance and behavior for signs of deception. But everything about him seemed genuine. His scent was right, his mannerisms were correct, and most importantly, he seemed as shaken by our experiences as I was. Whatever had been stalking us in the high country, Rex had apparently escaped its influence. Together, we began the long trek back toward civilization. The GPS was still showing impossible readings, but I had my compass and could roughly determine which direction would eventually lead to roads and people. We walked for 2 days through terrain that sometimes matched my maps and sometimes seemed to exist in its own pocket of geography. On the evening of the second day, I finally recognized a landmark, a distinctive rock formation that appeared on my map about 10 miles from the trailhead. Relief flooded through me so powerfully that I almost wept. We were going to make it out. But as we approached the final stretch of trail, Rex began acting strangely again. Not afraid, as he had been in the high country, but confused and agitated. He kept stopping and looking back the way we'd come, whining softly as if he'd forgotten something important. "Come on, boy," I encouraged him. "Almost there." He followed reluctantly, but his behavior became increasingly erratic as we neared the trailhead. By the time I could see my Subaru through the trees, he was actively resisting, pulling back on his collar and refusing to move forward. The car looked exactly as I'd left it, covered with a fine layer of dust from the gravel road but otherwise undisturbed. My relief at seeing it was overwhelming, proof that the normal world still existed, that I could escape whatever nightmare we'd wandered into. But as I approached the driver's door, I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice. There was another car parked beside mine, a silver Honda Civic with Oregon plates. Sarah's car. She was sitting in the driver's seat, watching me approach with an expression of patient concern. The real Sarah, not the shifting thing from the forest. She looked tired and worried, exactly how I'd expect someone to look after driving all the way to Idaho to check on their estranged ex-husband. "Kenneth?" She got out of the car slowly, as if afraid any sudden movement might spook me. "Are you okay? You look terrible." Rex immediately ran to her, tail wagging, seeking the attention she'd always given him during our marriage. Her response was perfectly natural. She knelt down and let him jump on her, scratching behind his ears in the way that always made him squirm with pleasure. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice hoarse from days of limited conversation. "Your mother called me," she said, still petting Rex. "When you didn't check in yesterday like you promised, she got worried. She asked me to drive up and make sure you were okay." Yesterday? I had no memory of promising to check in with anyone, and it had been 4 days since I'd had any cell service. But looking at Sarah, really looking at her, I could see no signs of the supernatural mimicry I'd encountered in the forest. This was just my ex-wife, worried about someone she'd once loved despite all the bitterness of our divorce. "How long have I been gone?" I asked. She looked at me with concern. 3 days, Kenneth. You said you'd be back yesterday, when you didn't answer your phone. 3 days. Not the week I'd planned. Not the 4 days I remembered. 3 days. I looked at my watch, which I'd been checking regularly during the hike, and felt reality shift around me. The date showed that Sarah was right. I'd only been gone 3 days. "I saw you," I said quietly, "in the forest. Something that looked like you." Her expression shifted from concern to gentle confusion. "Kenneth, I've been in Portland the whole time until this morning. Are you sure you're feeling okay? You look like you haven't slept in days." Rex continued to lavish attention on her, showing no signs of the fear or confusion he'd displayed during our forest encounters. To him, this was just Sarah, familiar and safe and completely normal. But I remembered the thing in the forest, the perfect mimicry, the glowing eyes. I remembered the voice calling my name from the head wall, the Rex thing that had smiled with too many teeth. I remembered 4 days of terror and impossibility, not 3 days of normal camping. "We need to go," I said, moving toward my car. "Of course," Sarah agreed readily. "Do you want me to follow you back to town? We could get some coffee, talk about—" "No." The word came out harsher than I intended. "I mean, thank you for coming, but I need to be alone right now." She studied my face for a long moment, and I could see her cataloging the changes, the hollow look around my eyes, the way my hands shook slightly, the paranoid glances I kept casting at the tree line. "Kenneth, whatever happened out there, you don't have to deal with it alone. I know things between us ended badly, but I still care about you." Her concern seemed genuine, her mannerisms completely familiar. But standing there in the fading daylight, I couldn't shake the memory of watching her face shift and change in the forest. Couldn't forget the sound of wind through leaves when she laughed. "I know," I said, "but I really need to go." Rex seemed torn between us, looking back and forth as if sensing the tension. Finally, he trotted over to my car and sat by the passenger door, making his choice clear. Sarah nodded slowly. "Okay, but Kenneth, if you need anything at all, please call me. I mean that." I managed to nod and get into my car without looking directly at her again. As I drove away, I watched her in the rearview mirror. She stood beside her Honda for a long time, growing smaller in the distance but never disappearing entirely. Even when I'd turned onto the main road and she should have been completely out of sight, I could still see her figure in my mirror, motionless and watching. The drive back to Boise took 4 hours, and I spent every mile wrestling with what had happened in the wilderness. The rational part of my mind insisted that I'd experienced some kind of breakdown, stress-induced hallucinations brought on by isolation, the divorce, and the weight of starting over. People got lost in familiar territory all the time, and the mind could play incredible tricks when under pressure. But Rex had experienced it too, Dogs didn't have stress-induced hallucinations about supernatural mimics. Dogs didn't imagine their reality shifting around them or mistake the passage of time. I checked into a motel on the outskirts of town and spent the night staring at the ceiling, afraid to sleep and afraid to stay awake. Rex seemed normal again, but I caught myself studying him in the poor light from the bathroom, looking for signs that this wasn't really my dog. The paranoia was exhausting, but I couldn't shake it. In the morning, I drove to my storage unit and retrieved a box of old photos. I needed to see pictures of Rex as a puppy, images that would prove this was really him and not some perfect imitation. As I flipped through the photos, matching details and confirming memories, I found something that made my hands tremble. There, in a photo from our wedding day, was Sarah standing beside my car in the church parking lot. She was wearing the same expression of patient concern I'd seen at the trailhead, and she was casting no shadow on the asphalt despite the bright afternoon sun. I've been back in town for 3 weeks now, and life has gradually returned to normal. I found a new apartment, got back to work, and established new routines. Rex seems completely himself, showing no signs of our wilderness experience. I've almost convinced myself that the whole thing was some kind of psychological episode brought on by stress and isolation. Almost. But sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I catch Rex watching me with an expression that seems too knowing, too human. Sometimes I wake in the night to find him sitting perfectly still in the darkness, staring at me with eyes that seem to glow with their own light. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see my own face wearing that same patient, concerned expression I'd seen on Sarah at the trailhead. The thing about perfect mimics is that once they've studied you long enough, they don't need to wear other faces anymore. They can just become you, completely and forever, and no one, not even you, would ever know the difference. I'm writing this down because I need someone to know what happened, even if that someone is just a future version of myself who might have forgotten, or who might not be me at all. Rex is sitting beside me as I write this, and he looks exactly like my dog. Every detail is perfect, every behavior is correct. But when I reached down to pet him a moment ago, his fur felt cold despite the warm apartment, and for just an instant, I could have sworn I felt fingertips instead of paws pressing back against my hand. I don't know if I'm still Kenneth Young, or if I'm something that learned to be Kenneth Young so perfectly that even I believe it. I don't know if the real Kenneth ever made it out of that wilderness, or if he's still up there somewhere, wandering through impossible geography while something else lives his life. All I know is that every night I dream of climbing back up that trail toward the Alpine Lakes. And every morning I wake up wanting to go home to a place that doesn't exist on any map. If you're reading this and you knew me before, watch for the signs. Perfect mimicry has its tells, if you know what to look for. And if you're planning a wilderness trip to Idaho, stay away from the Frank Church area. Some places are better left unexplored. The thing that might be Kenneth Young is going to sleep now. Tomorrow it will go to work and live a normal life and probably never think about the wilderness again. But sometimes, late at night, it will remember the sound of its own name being called from the darkness, and it will smile with too many teeth. Rex is still watching me. His eyes are glowing. My name is Brian Wright, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the Sawtooth National Forest in Idaho, near the remote Stanley Basin, during what was supposed to be a simple 3-day hiking trip with my best friend Kevin. Kevin, King, and I had been planning this trip for months. We both worked soul-crushing desk jobs in Boise, him as an insurance adjuster, me in IT support, and we desperately needed to disconnect from the digital world that was slowly consuming our lives. Kevin had discovered this remote trail system near Redfish Lake, far from the touristy spots, where we could hike deep into the wilderness and camp under stars unpolluted by city lights. "It'll be perfect, Brian," Kevin had said, spreading out the topographical maps across my kitchen table. "Look here. Iron Creek Trail winds up into the backcountry for miles. We can set up base camp near these unnamed peaks and explore the alpine lakes. No cell service, no internet, just us and nature. Kevin was always the outdoorsman between us. At 29, he was lean and wiry from weekend rock climbing adventures, with sun-bleached hair and the kind of perpetual tan that came from actually living outside his apartment. I was softer around the edges, pale from too many hours under fluorescent lights, but I'd been hitting the gym for months preparing for this trip. We started our hike on a crisp October morning, the aspen leaves painting the mountainsides in brilliant gold and orange. The trailhead at Iron Creek was deserted, exactly what we'd wanted. Kevin shouldered his massive pack with practiced ease while I struggled to balance mine, already feeling the weight of our 3-day supply of freeze-dried meals and camping gear. "You sure you packed enough?" Kevin grinned, nodding at my bulging pack. "Better safe than sorry," I replied, adjusting the hip belt for the 10th time. "Besides, you're the one who insisted we bring that enormous tent." Four-season protection, my friend. Weather changes fast up here. The first few hours of hiking were exactly what I'd imagined. The trail wound alongside Iron Creek, the water rushing clear and cold over smooth granite boulders. Towering ponderosa pines stretched toward a crystalline blue sky, and the air carried the clean scent of pine needles and mountain stone. Kevin maintained a steady pace ahead of me, occasionally stopping to point out wildlife tracks in the soft earth or to wait while I caught my breath. "Look at that," he said around mile 3, pointing across a small meadow dotted with late-season wildflowers. "Elk sign everywhere. This is pristine habitat." I nodded, more focused on the burning sensation in my calves than on Kevin's nature observations. But I had to admit, it felt good to be moving, to feel my body working for something other than typing reports and fixing password problems. We gained elevation steadily throughout the day, the creek growing smaller and more tumultuous as we climbed. By late afternoon, we'd reached our planned camping spot, a small alpine cirque surrounded by imposing granite peaks that Kevin had identified on the map as being unnamed and unclimbed. A tiny lake reflected the surrounding summits like a dark mirror, and a few scattered whitebark pines provided some wind protection. "Perfect," Kevin announced, dropping his pack near a flat spot about 50 yards from the water's edge. "We'll set up here." I collapsed gratefully onto a sun-warmed boulder, my pack sliding to the ground with a solid thud. The silence was overwhelming after months of city noise. No traffic, no sirens, no humming electronics. Just the whisper of wind through pine needles and the gentle lapping of water against the rocky shoreline. "It's beautiful," I admitted. "I can see why you wanted to come here." Kevin was already unpacking his gear with military efficiency. "Wait until you see the stars tonight. No light pollution for 100 miles. We spent the next hour setting up camp. Kevin's four-season mountaineering tent was a complex affair of carbon fiber poles and guy lines, but it looked bomb-proof once erected. I focused on organizing our food and filtering water from the lake while Kevin gathered firewood from the scattered deadfall around our site. As the sun began to sink behind the western peaks, painting the granite walls in shades of pink and gold, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: genuine peace. The stress of work, bills, and urban living seemed to evaporate in the thin mountain air. "This was a great idea, Kev," I said as we sat by our small campfire spooning down reconstituted pasta and chicken. I'd forgotten what quiet actually sounds like. Kevin smiled, but something in his expression seemed different in the flickering firelight. "Yeah, it's quiet all right, sometimes too quiet." I looked at him more carefully. "What do you mean?" He shook his head. "Nothing, just... I've been up here before, you know, a few years ago. Solo trip." There's something about these mountains that gets to you after a while. The isolation. But that's the point, isn't it? To get away from everything? Sure. Kevin poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. It's just that sometimes when you're really alone up here, your mind starts playing tricks on you. You hear things that aren't there, see movements in your peripheral vision. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. "What kind of things?" Kevin was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "Probably nothing. Just the wind through the trees, animals moving around. But up here, especially at night, every sound gets amplified. Your brain tries to make patterns out of random noise." The fire crackled and popped, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called with a haunting, otherworldly voice. I found myself listening more intently to the darkness beyond our small circle of light, suddenly aware of how vast and empty the wilderness around us truly was. "Have you tried your phone?" Kevin asked suddenly. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and glanced at the screen. No signal, as expected, but something else was wrong. The time displayed as 12 E's, blinking like a digital clock after a power outage. "That's weird," I said, showing Kevin the screen. "It was working fine this morning." Kevin checked his own phone and frowned. "Same thing. Must be something about the altitude, or maybe some kind of electromagnetic interference from the granite." We both laughed it off, but I noticed Kevin kept glancing at his dead phone throughout the evening, as if expecting it to suddenly spring back to life. Without our digital connection to the outside world, the wilderness felt even more remote and isolating. As full darkness settled over our camp, Kevin was right about the stars. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light, more brilliant than I'd ever seen it. But despite the spectacular display, I found myself fighting an inexplicable sense of unease. The darkness beyond our fire seemed absolute, pressing in on us from all sides. "I'm going to turn in," I announced around 10 o'clock, though without functioning watches it was impossible to know the actual time. "That hike kicked my ass." "Yeah, me too," Kevin agreed. "Big day tomorrow." "I want to try that peak to the north." We banked the fire and crawled into our respective sleeping bags inside the tent. Kevin fell asleep almost immediately, his breathing steady and deep. But I lay awake for what felt like hours, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the mountain night. Wind sighed through the pines with an almost human voice. Small animals rustled through the underbrush. And somewhere in the distance I could swear I heard footsteps. The rational part of my brain knew it was probably just a deer or elk moving through the forest. But in the oppressive darkness of the tent, my imagination began to run wild. The footsteps seemed too regular, too deliberate to be an animal. They circled our camp at a distance, never coming close enough to see, but never quite fading away completely. I must have finally dozed off because I woke to the sound of Kevin unzipping the tent fly. "Where are you going?" I whispered. "Just need to take a leak," he whispered back. "Go back to sleep." I heard his footsteps moving away from the tent, heading toward the tree line. Then silence. I waited for him to return, but minutes stretched by with no sound of movement. The fire had died to barely glowing embers, and the darkness outside seemed to swallow everything. "Kevin?" I called softly. No response. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, straining to hear any sign of my friend's return. My rational mind supplied a dozen innocent explanations. Maybe he'd decided to walk down to the lake, or perhaps he was having stomach trouble from the freeze-dried food. But as the silence stretched on, a cold knot of anxiety began forming in my chest. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I fumbled for my headlamp and crawled out of the tent. The LED beam cut through the darkness, revealing our small camp exactly as we'd left it. But there was no sign of Kevin. "Kevin!" I called out, louder this time. My voice echoed off the granite walls and faded into nothing. The silence that followed was absolute and oppressive. I walked the perimeter of our campsite, following Kevin's footprints in the soft earth. They led toward a cluster of pines about 30 yards from the tent, then simply vanished. Not faded or obscured, vanished as if Kevin had simply ceased to exist mid-step. Panic began to claw at my throat. This wasn't possible. People didn't just disappear without a trace. I expanded my search, sweeping my headlamp beam back and forth across the ground, looking for any sign of where Kevin might have gone. But the rocky terrain beyond the trees showed no tracks, no disturbed vegetation. Nothing. I called his name until my voice was hoarse, the echoes mocking me from the surrounding peaks. The only response was the distant call of that same owl, its voice somehow more menacing now in the context of Kevin's disappearance. Hours passed. I kept the fire built up, feeding it deadfall until the flames leaped high into the night sky, hoping the light would guide Kevin back to camp. But as the first pale hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, I had to face the possibility that something terrible had happened to my friend. As morning light revealed the cirque in stark detail, I began a systematic search of the surrounding area. The lake was crystal clear and shallow enough that I could see the bottom. Kevin wasn't there. The granite slopes were too steep and exposed for him to have climbed in the dark without gear. The forest was dense but not impenetrable, and I spent hours pushing through the undergrowth, calling his name and listening for any response. By midday, I was exhausted and terrified. I'd covered every inch of terrain within a reasonable distance of our camp, and there was simply no trace of Kevin. It was as if he'd been plucked from the earth by invisible hands. I was sitting by the lake, trying to decide whether to hike out for help or continue searching, when I heard footsteps behind me. "Brian?" I spun around to see Kevin emerging from the tree line, walking casually toward camp as if nothing had happened. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by anger. "Jesus Christ, Kevin! Where the hell have you been? I've been searching for hours." He looked at me with a puzzled expression. "Searching? What are you talking about? I just went to gather some firewood." I stared at him in disbelief. "Firewood? Kevin, you've been gone all night. It's almost 2 in the afternoon." Kevin glanced around, his brow furrowed in confusion. "That's impossible. I only left a few minutes ago." He looked down at his hands, which were indeed carrying an armload of dry branches. "See? Firewood." Something was wrong. Kevin's voice sounded flat, emotionless. And now that I looked more closely, his appearance was off. His skin had a grayish pallor, and his eyes seemed somehow deeper set than I remembered. Most disturbing of all, he hadn't blinked once since I'd started talking to him. "Where did you go last night?" I asked carefully. "After you left the tent?" Kevin tilted his head slightly, like a dog hearing a strange sound. "I don't remember leaving the tent. I remember going to sleep, and then I woke up this morning and decided we needed more firewood." The knot of anxiety in my chest tightened. This wasn't Kevin. Not the Kevin I'd known for 15 years. This person had his face, his voice, his memories, but something fundamental was missing. The spark of personality, the quick humor, the restless energy that made Kevin who he was. "Are you feeling okay?" I asked. "You seem different." Kevin smiled, but it was all wrong. Too wide, lasting too long, not reaching his eyes. "I feel wonderful, Brian. Better than I have in years. The mountain air is so invigorating." He dropped the firewood with a casual gesture and began walking toward our tent. His movements were too fluid, too controlled, like a predator stalking its prey. Every instinct I had was screaming that I was in danger. "I think we should head back," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Break camp and hike out today." Kevin stopped and turned to look at me. For just a moment, his facade slipped, and I saw something ancient and hungry looking out through his eyes. Then the false smile returned. "But we just got here, Brian. Don't you want to explore? There's so much to see in these mountains. So much to experience." The way he said that last word made my skin crawl. I began backing slowly toward the tent, keeping my eyes on Kevin while my mind raced through possible explanations. Hypothermia could cause confusion and personality changes, but the night hadn't been that cold. A head injury might explain the memory loss, but I couldn't see any signs of trauma. Or maybe I was the one losing my mind. Maybe the isolation and stress of Kevin's disappearance had pushed me over some psychological edge, and I was imagining the changes in his behavior. "Let's just pack up," I said, reaching for my sleeping bag. "We can always come back another time." Kevin moved with inhuman speed, crossing the distance between us in a single fluid motion. His hand clamped down on my wrist with crushing force, and I could feel bones grinding together. "I don't think so, Brian," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I've been so hungry, so very, very hungry, and you're going to help me fix that." I looked into his eyes and saw my own death reflected there. Whatever was wearing Kevin's face, it wasn't human. It never had been human. The hunger Kevin spoke of wasn't for food. It was for something far more fundamental and terrifying. I yanked my arm away and ran. The granite slopes that had seemed too steep to climb without gear suddenly became my only hope of escape. I scrambled up the loose scree, sending small avalanches of rock cascading behind me, driven by pure terror. Behind me, I could hear Kevin, or the thing that had taken his place, pursuing me with the relentless patience of a born predator. "You can't run forever, Brian," his voice echoed off the rock walls. "I know these mountains now. Every trail, every hiding place." "And when you get tired, when you finally collapse from exhaustion, I'll be waiting." I didn't look back. I couldn't afford to look back. I climbed until my lungs burned and my fingers bled from gripping the sharp granite. Behind me, Kevin's pursuit was eerily silent. No heavy breathing, no sounds of exertion, just the steady scrape of feet on stone. The slope leveled out onto a narrow ledge about halfway up the cirque wall. I risked a glance down and saw Kevin climbing below me, moving with impossible ease across terrain that should have required ropes and technical gear. His movements were too fluid, too coordinated, as if gravity affected him differently than it did normal humans. I continued climbing, driven by desperation rather than skill. The ledge narrowed until I was traversing across exposed rock hundreds of feet above the cirque floor. One slip would mean death, but that seemed preferable to whatever Kevin had planned for me. The traverse led to a small cave about the size of a closet, carved into the granite by centuries of freeze-thaw cycles. I squeezed inside and tried to catch my breath while listening for sounds of pursuit. For a moment, there was only silence. Then Kevin's voice drifted up from somewhere below, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. "I can smell your fear, Brian. It's intoxicating." "Do you know what I am?" I pressed myself deeper into the cave, trying to become invisible. My rational mind was completely overwhelmed by primal terror, reducing me to a cowering animal hiding from a predator. "I'm what your ancestors whispered about around their fires?" Kevin continued, his voice now seeming to come from directly outside the cave entrance. "I'm what made them huddle together in the darkness, afraid to venture alone into the wilderness. I'm hunger given form, need given flesh." A shadow fell across the cave entrance. I could see Kevin's silhouette against the afternoon sky, but his proportions were wrong. He seemed too tall, too angular, as if his bones had been stretched and rearranged into something that only resembled human form. The thing about hunger, Brian, is that it grows. It spreads. It consumes everything it touches until nothing is left but appetite. Kevin's shadow moved closer to the cave entrance. "Your friend fought me at first." His mind was strong, full of memories and personality and all those things that make humans think they're special. But in the end, the hunger was stronger. I realized with dawning horror what had happened to the real Kevin. He hadn't disappeared. He'd been consumed, devoured from the inside out by something that wore his flesh like a costume. But I'm still hungry, Brian. So very hungry. And you're going to feed me. Kevin's head appeared in the cave entrance, but it was no longer Kevin's head. The features had shifted, elongated, becoming something that might have been human once but had been twisted by an alien appetite into something else entirely. His mouth stretched in a grin that showed far too many teeth, all of them pointed like a shark's. I scrambled backward until I hit the rear wall of the cave, trapped with nowhere left to run. Kevin reached toward me with fingers that had grown too long, ending in yellow claws that scraped against the stone. "The best part," he whispered, "is that you'll still be conscious while I consume you. You'll feel everything as I devour your memories, your personality, your very essence. And when I'm done, there'll be nothing left of Brian Wright except hunger wearing his face." Something inside me snapped. The terror that had been paralyzing me suddenly transformed into rage. Rage at Kevin's death, at my own helplessness, at this thing that had violated one of the most sacred places on Earth with its presence. I grabbed a loose chunk of granite from the cave floor and swung it with all my strength at Kevin's misshapen head. The rock connected with a wet crunch, and Kevin reeled backward with a shriek of pain and fury that sounded like wind howling through a canyon. Black blood sprayed from the wound, hissing and smoking where it hit the stone. Kevin's face began to shift and change, revealing glimpses of the true horror beneath the human disguise, something with too many joints and eyes that reflected light like a nocturnal predator's. I didn't wait to see what other changes would manifest. I squeezed past Kevin's writhing form and rappelled down the cliff face, using cracks and handholds that no sane person would trust with their life. Loose rock cascaded around me, but somehow I made it to the bottom of the cirque with only minor cuts and scrapes. Above me, Kevin's inhuman screams echoed off the granite walls, a sound of pure malevolence that made my bones ache. I grabbed my pack from our abandoned campsite and ran toward the trail, abandoning everything else in my desperation to escape. The hike out was a nightmare of exhaustion and paranoia. Every shadow could be hiding Kevin's transformed shape. Every sound could be the approach of something that wanted to hollow me out and wear my skin. I pushed myself beyond physical limits, running when I should have walked, climbing when I should have rested. As I descended toward the trailhead, the familiar sounds of civilization began to filter through the forest. Distant traffic on Highway 75, the hum of power lines, the rumble of a plane passing overhead. These mundane noises had never sounded so beautiful. My truck was exactly where I'd left it 3 days earlier, covered in a thin layer of pine needles and dust. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the ignition. But the engine turned over on the first try, and I backed out of the parking area with a spray of gravel. I didn't stop driving until I reached the Stanley Ranger Station, where I stumbled through the front door looking like a wild man. The ranger on duty took one look at me and reached for his radio. "Sir, are you all right? Do you need medical attention?" I tried to explain what had happened, but the words sounded insane even to me. A creature that had consumed my friend and taken his place? Something that fed on human essence in the remote wilderness of Idaho? The ranger listened with professional patience while clearly preparing to have me committed for a psychiatric evaluation. In the end, they organized a search and rescue operation. Helicopters combed the Iron Creek drainage for 3 days, looking for any sign of Kevin King. They found our abandoned campsite, complete with Kevin's gear and sleeping bag. But they found no trace of Kevin himself. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead due to a wilderness accident. Possible causes included falling from a cliff, drowning in one of the alpine lakes, or being attacked by wildlife. I was treated for exhaustion and dehydration, then questioned extensively by Park Service investigators who clearly suspected I might have been involved in Kevin's disappearance. But I knew the truth. Something ancient and hungry lived in those remote peaks. Something that the early settlers and indigenous peoples had known enough to fear. Kevin's disappearance wasn't an accident. It was a feeding. I never went back to the wilderness. I moved away from Idaho within a month, taking a job in Phoenix where the nearest mountains were hours away and the desert offered no hiding places for things that shouldn't exist. I told myself I was starting over, putting the trauma behind me. But sometimes, late at night when the city is quiet, I hear Kevin's voice calling my name. And when I look in the mirror, I sometimes see a hunger in my own eyes that wasn't there before. The creature that took Kevin had tasted me too, just for a moment when it grabbed my wrist. And I wonder if it left something behind, some seed of appetite that's slowly growing in the darkness of my soul. I tell myself it's just paranoia, just the lingering effects of trauma and survivor's guilt. But deep down, I know better. The hunger is patient. It can wait years, decades, for the right moment to bloom. And when it does, I'll understand exactly what Kevin felt in those final moments before something wearing his face walked out of the wilderness. The worst part is that I've started having dreams about going back. Dreams about returning to that remote cirque in the Sawtooth Mountains, about finding Kevin waiting for me by the dark lake. In the dreams, he smiles with too many teeth and welcomes me home. And the terrifying thing is that part of me wants to go. The hunger is growing. I can feel it spreading through my thoughts like frost creeping across a window. Soon, it will be strong enough to take control. And when that happens, Brian Wright will disappear just like Kevin King did, leaving only appetite wearing a human face. But for now, I fight it. I tell this story to anyone who will listen, hoping that someone will believe, someone will understand the danger that waits in the deep wilderness. because the thing that took Kevin is still out there, still hungry, still looking for the next solo hiker or isolated camper to feed upon. Stay away from the remote places. Stay away from the unnamed peaks and the dark lakes where no one goes. Because in the wilderness, you're never truly alone. Something is always watching, always waiting, always hungry for what makes you human. And once it tastes you, it never lets you go. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness in central Idaho, along the middle fork of the Salmon River, in September of last year. David Jones had been my best friend since college, and when he suggested we take a week-long hiking trip into one of the most remote wilderness areas in the continental United States, I jumped at the chance. We'd been planning it for months, a chance to disconnect from our suffocating office jobs and reconnect with something primal and real. David had always been the outdoorsman between us, the one who could read topographical maps like poetry and knew which plants were safe to eat. I was just along for the adventure, happy to follow his lead into the vast emptiness of central Idaho. We started our trek from the Flying Bee Ranch, loading our packs with enough supplies for 7 days in the backcountry. The plan was simple. Hike 20 miles into the wilderness along the Middle Fork, set up a base camp near Marble Creek, and spend a few days exploring the surrounding peaks and valleys. No cell towers, no Wi-Fi, no notifications. Just us, the mountains, and the kind of silence that city dwellers like us had almost forgotten existed. The first 2 days went exactly as planned. We made good time along the established trail, crossing crystal-clear streams and camping in meadows that seemed untouched by human presence. David was in his element, pointing out elk tracks, identifying bird calls, and setting up camp with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 100 times before. I felt my shoulders unknot as the distance from civilization grew, the constant hum of anxiety that had plagued me for months finally beginning to fade. It was on the third morning that things started to feel off. I woke before dawn to the sound of David rustling around outside our tent. Through the thin nylon walls, I could see his silhouette moving in the pre-dawn darkness, and I assumed he was starting the fire for breakfast. But when I unzipped the tent flap and stepped outside, the fire ring was cold and empty. David was standing about 30 feet away, perfectly still, staring into the tree line. "Morning, Dave," I called softly, not wanting to shatter the morning quiet. "Everything okay?" He didn't respond immediately. For a long moment, he remained motionless, his head cocked slightly to one side as if listening to something I couldn't hear. When he finally turned toward me, his smile seemed forced, stretched a little too wide across his face. "Just listening to the woods wake up," he said, but his voice carried a strange, distant quality that made the hair on my neck prickle. "The sounds are different here." I listened, but all I could hear was the gentle murmur of Marble Creek and the occasional bird call echoing through the forest. Different how? David's smile faltered for just a moment, and something flickered across his features. Confusion, maybe, or fear. But then the expression was gone, replaced by his usual easy grin. "Forget it, Mike. Must be the altitude messing with my head. Let's get some breakfast going." The rest of the morning proceeded normally, but I couldn't shake the image of David standing motionless in the darkness, listening to sounds that weren't there. As we broke camp and continued deeper into the wilderness, I found myself studying his profile, looking for signs of whatever had seemed so strange about him in those pre-dawn moments. By afternoon, we'd reached our planned base campsite, a small clearing beside the creek, surrounded by towering lodgepole pines and offering a perfect view of the jagged peaks that rose like broken teeth against the sky. We set up our tent and established a fire ring, and by evening, everything felt normal again. David seemed like himself, cracking jokes as we cooked dinner over the open flame and sharing stories from our college days. It was only when we were preparing for bed that I noticed our GPS unit wasn't working properly. "Hey, Dave," I said, frowning at the small screen. "This thing is acting weird. It keeps showing our location as changing, even though we're sitting still." David looked over my shoulder at the device, which was indeed showing our position jumping erratically across the map, sometimes placing us miles from our actual location, sometimes showing us in areas that the topographical map indicated were solid rock faces. "Must be the terrain," David said, but his voice had that distant quality again. "These deep valleys can mess with satellite reception." I nodded, accepting the explanation, but something about the way the GPS was malfunctioning bothered me. The jumps weren't random. They seemed to follow some kind of pattern, always pulling our indicated position north, deeper into the wilderness. I was about to mention this when David yawned loudly and announced he was ready for sleep. That night I dreamed of walking through endless forests where the trees grew taller the deeper I went, their branches eventually blotting out the sky entirely. In the dream, I could hear David calling my name from somewhere ahead, but no matter how fast I walked, his voice never seemed to get any closer. When I woke, the fire had burned down to glowing embers and David's sleeping bag was empty. I sat up quickly, my heart hammering in my chest. "Dave," I whispered, not wanting to shout and potentially wake whatever wildlife might be nearby. No response. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cold mountain air. The creek gurgled softly in the darkness, and a light breeze rustled through the pine needles overhead. "David," I called, louder this time. My voice echoed off the surrounding peaks and faded into silence. I swept my flashlight beam around the campsite, looking for any sign of where he might have gone. His boots were still beside the tent, which meant he'd left in his socks, not something an experienced outdoorsman would do in terrain like this. I was beginning to panic when I heard his voice calling from somewhere in the darkness beyond the tree line. "Mike! Hey, Mike, come here! You've got to see this!" Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by irritation. "What the hell, Dave? You scared the shit out of me." "Just come here." His voice seemed to come from different directions each time he spoke, as if he were moving around in the darkness. "This is incredible." I grabbed my hiking boots and quickly laced them up, then followed his voice into the forest. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing the ghostly white trunks of aspen trees and the skeletal branches of dead pines. The forest floor was carpeted with fallen needles that muffled my footsteps, making the woods feel unnaturally quiet. "Dave, where are you?" I called, but got no response. I pushed deeper into the trees, following what I thought was a game trail. The forest seemed to grow denser the farther I went, the canopy overhead blocking out the stars until I was moving through a tunnel of absolute darkness, guided only by my flashlight beam. The air grew colder, carrying strange scents, something sweet and cloying that reminded me of overripe fruit, mixed with an underlying metallic smell that made my stomach turn. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, I realized I was lost. The trail I'd been following had disappeared, and when I tried to retrace my steps, everything looked the same. Worse, I hadn't heard David's voice in at least 10 minutes. Fighting down a rising tide of panic, I tried to use my compass to navigate back to camp. But the needle spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. When I checked my GPS, the screen showed only static. I was standing in a small clearing, trying to decide which direction to go, when I heard footsteps approaching through the trees. Relief washed over me as David's familiar silhouette emerged from the darkness. "There you are," I said, lowering my flashlight. "I've been looking everywhere for you. What were you trying to show me?" David didn't answer immediately. He stood at the edge of the clearing just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam, perfectly still. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded different, hollow somehow, as if it were coming from a great distance. "I found something wonderful, Mike. Something that's been waiting for us." "What are you talking about?" I stepped closer, raising my flashlight to get a better look at his face. "And why did you leave camp without your boots?" The beam illuminated David's features, and I immediately knew something was terribly wrong. His skin had a grayish pallor, almost luminescent in the artificial light. His eyes, usually a warm brown, now appeared black and depthless. Most disturbing of all was his smile. That same too wide grin I'd seen that morning, but now revealing teeth that seemed longer and sharper than they should be. "We don't need boots where we're going," he said, taking a step toward me. "We don't need anything from the old world anymore." I backed away, my hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife on my belt. "Dave, you're freaking me out. What's wrong with you?" He tilted his head to one side, studying me with those black, empty eyes. "Nothing's wrong, Mike. I've never felt better. I've never been more hungry." The way he said that last word sent ice through my veins. I turned and ran. Behind me, I heard David laugh, a sound like wind through a graveyard. "You can't run forever, Mike. The forest goes on, and I know all its secrets now." I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face and tearing at my clothes. My flashlight beam bounced wildly as I ran, casting chaotic shadows that seemed to reach for me with grasping fingers. I had no idea which direction I was going, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away from whatever David had become. The forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, each tree looking identical to the last. No matter how long I ran, I never seemed to make any progress. Worse, I could hear David's voice calling to me from the darkness, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes from directions that should have been impossible. "There's nowhere to run, Mike. The forest is alive and it's hungry too. It's been so long since it's had fresh meat." I stumbled and fell, scraping my hands on the rocky ground. When I looked up, my flashlight illuminated a sight that made my blood freeze. Scattered around the forest floor were bones. Not animal bones, but human remains picked clean and bleached white by years of exposure. Some still had scraps of clothing clinging to them, and I could see a hiking boot that looked disturbingly modern. The others thought they could escape too. David's voice drifted through the trees, closer now. "But the forest always gets what it wants, and what it wants is to feed." I forced myself to my feet and kept moving, trying to navigate by the stars when I could glimpse them through breaks in the canopy. But even the stars seemed wrong. Constellations I didn't recognize, patterns that hurt to look at directly. After what felt like hours of running, I stumbled into another clearing. This one was different, though, larger, with strange symbols carved into the surrounding trees. The symbols seemed to shift and writhe in my flashlight beam, and looking at them too long made my head ache. In the center of the clearing was a circle of standing stones, each about 6 feet tall and covered in the same writhing symbols. The air inside the circle shimmered like heat waves despite the cold mountain night. "Beautiful, isn't it?" David's voice came from directly behind me. I spun around to find him standing just a few feet away. Up close, the changes were even more horrifying. His fingernails had grown into claws, his canine teeth now protruded like fangs, and his skin had taken on a mottled, diseased appearance. But worst of all were his eyes, completely black now, reflecting my flashlight beam like an animal's. "What happened to you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I found the truth," he said, circling me slowly like a predator stalking its prey. "This place is older than the mountains, older than the forests. It's been waiting for so long, Mike, waiting for someone to feed it, to help it grow strong again." "This isn't real," I said, backing toward the circle of stones. "You're sick, Dave. We need to get you to a hospital." He laughed again, that terrible wind-through-graves sound. "I've never been more alive. Can't you feel it, Mike? The hunger? It's beautiful. It's pure. No more worrying about mortgages or deadlines or any of the meaningless garbage that filled our old lives. Just the simple, perfect need to feed." "Feed on what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. His black eyes fixed on mine. "On you, old friend. On your fear, your pain, your flesh, everything that makes you human." He lunged at me with inhuman speed, his clawed hands reaching for my throat. I threw myself backward, stumbling into the circle of stones. The moment I crossed the threshold, the world exploded into chaos. The air itself seemed to scream, a sound that felt like ice picks being driven into my eardrums. The ground beneath my feet buckled and heaved, and the stones around me began to glow with a sickly phosphorescent light. Through the cacophony, I could hear David shrieking in rage and pain. When the noise finally stopped, I found myself lying on my back, staring up at a sky that was no longer black but a deep, unsettling red. The stars were gone, replaced by slowly rotating spirals of light that made my eyes water to look at. When I sat up, I saw that the forest around the clearing had changed too. The trees were now massive, twisted things that seemed to pulse with their own malevolent life. David stood at the edge of the circle, but he couldn't seem to cross the threshold. His inhuman features were even more pronounced now, his skin hanging in loose folds as if something inside him was trying to burst out. "You don't understand," he said, his voice now a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from every direction at once. "This is what we were meant to become, what we were always meant to become." "You're not David," I said, struggling to my feet. "You're something else, something that's been hiding in these mountains." The thing that had been my friend smiled with far too many teeth. "David is still here, Mike. He's screaming, deep inside where no one can hear him. He wants you to know that this is all your fault. If you hadn't insisted on coming here, if you hadn't been so eager to escape your meaningless little life, he would still be human." The words hit me like a physical blow. Part of me wanted to believe it was just psychological warfare, but a deeper, more honest part knew there was truth in what the creature was saying. I had been the one pushing for this trip, desperate to escape the crushing weight of my everyday existence. "But it's too late for regrets now," the David thing continued. "The circle is weakening. Soon I'll be able to cross, and then we can be together forever, just like we always planned." I could see that he was right. The glow from the stones was beginning to fade, and with each passing moment, the barrier seemed to grow thinner. I had maybe minutes before whatever ancient protection this place offered would fail completely. That's when I noticed something that the creature hadn't. A narrow path leading away from the clearing, visible only from inside the circle. It was covered in the same symbols as the stones, but these seemed different somehow, less malevolent, more like a warning than a curse. Without giving myself time to think about it, I ran for the path. The creature that had been David howled behind me, a sound that was half rage and half hunger. "You can't escape, Mike. The forest is mine now. Every tree, every shadow, every breath of wind. I'll hunt you until the mountains crumble." The path wound through the twisted forest, marked at intervals by smaller standing stones. Each stone I passed seemed to weaken the creature's voice until eventually I could no longer hear it at all. But I didn't stop running. Something deep in my primitive brain told me that stopping meant death, or worse, becoming like David. The red sky gradually began to lighten, taking on the gray-pink hues of dawn. As it did, the twisted trees slowly returned to their normal shapes, and the symbols on the stones became less distinct. By the time I reached the end of the path, exhausted and bleeding from dozens of cuts, the world looked almost normal again. Almost. I found myself standing on a high ridge overlooking a valley I didn't recognize. According to my mental map, this should have been looking down toward Marble Creek and our campsite, but instead, I saw a vast expanse of dead trees and blackened earth that stretched to the horizon. In the center of the devastation was a perfectly circular lake that reflected the sky like black glass. My hands shaking with exhaustion and terror, I pulled out my GPS. For the first time in days, it was working properly, but the reading made no sense. According to the device, I was standing more than 100 miles north of where I should be, in an area that the topographical maps showed as uninhabited wilderness. That's when I saw the smoke. Far below, at the edge of the dead zone, a thin column of gray smoke rose into the morning air. It was too regular to be a forest fire, too isolated to be a natural phenomenon. Someone had lit a campfire. Fighting every instinct that told me to run in the opposite direction, I made my way down the ridge toward the smoke. What choice did I have? I was lost, probably hundreds of miles from civilization, with no food or water beyond what I carried in my day pack. If there were other people here, they might be my only chance of survival. The hike down took most of the morning. As I got closer to the smoke, I could make out details of what lay ahead. A small log cabin sitting on the shore of the Black Lake. The building looked old but well-maintained, with a stone chimney from which the smoke was rising. A wooden dock extended into the lake, and tied to it was a small motorboat. I approached cautiously, calling out when I was still 50 yards away. "Hello, is anyone there? I'm lost and need help." The door of the cabin opened and a figure emerged, an elderly man with long gray hair and a beard, dressed in worn flannel and jeans. He raised a hand in greeting and walked toward me with the slow, careful gait of someone who'd spent a lifetime navigating rough terrain. "Well, I'll be damned," he said when he was close enough to speak normally. "Haven't seen another soul out here in... Oh, must be going on 3 years now. Name's Walter Morrison. What brings you to this god-forsaken corner of creation?" I introduced myself and gave him an abbreviated version of what had happened. That I'd been camping with a friend, gotten separated, and become lost. I didn't mention the supernatural elements. The man would probably think I was suffering from hypothermia-induced hallucinations. Walter listened without interruption, nodding occasionally. When I finished, he scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Your friend," he said. "What did he look like when you last saw him?" The question surprised me. "Why do you ask?" "Just answer the question, son." I described David, both the normal version and the thing he'd become. Walter's expression grew increasingly grim as I spoke. "Yeah," he said when I finished. "I've seen him, or what's left of him. Been prowling around the edges of the dead zone for the past few days, calling out names. Sometimes he sounds like himself, sometimes like a dozen people talking at once. You know what happened to him?" Walter gestured toward the cabin. "Come inside. There's coffee on the stove, and this is a conversation best had sitting down." The interior of the cabin was sparse but comfortable. A single room with a wood stove, a small kitchen area, and shelves lined with books and journals. Walter poured 2 cups of coffee from a battered pot and settled into a wooden chair across from me. "I used to be a forest ranger," he began. "Worked these mountains for 37 years before I retired. Saw a lot of strange things in that time, things that don't make it into the official reports, but nothing as bad as what happened 5 years ago." He gestured toward the window, beyond which lay the expanse of dead trees and black water. "Used to be prime forest out there, lodgepole pine, Douglas fir, some of the most beautiful country you've ever seen. Then they found the cave." "What cave?" "Archaeological team from Boise State. They were mapping indigenous sites when they came across a cave system about 2 miles north of here. Inside, they found evidence of human habitation going back thousands of years. But it wasn't just any human habitation. It was something older, something that predated any known culture in the region." Walter took a sip of his coffee, his eyes distant with memory. "The symbols they found in there, they hurt to look at, son. Made your eyes water and your head ache. The team leader, a professor named Hendricks, he became obsessed with them. Spent weeks mapping every inch of those caves, copying down every symbol, trying to translate what he called the most significant archaeological find in North American history." "What happened to them?" "They disappeared, all 5 of them, just vanished one night. When the university sent a search team, they found the camp empty, the tents still set up, dinner still cooking over the fire, but no sign of the people." Walter stood and walked to the window, staring out at the dead zone. "That's when the forest started dying. Started with the trees nearest the cave and spread outward in a perfect circle. Everything it touched just withered. Animals fled the area. Birds wouldn't fly over it. Even the insects died. And the lake appeared overnight. One day there was solid ground. The next morning there was a lake a 1/4 mile across. The water's not natural, son. It doesn't reflect light the way water should, and it's warm to the touch even in the dead of winter." I thought about the creature that had been David, about the hunger in its voice and the inhuman intelligence behind its eyes. "You think the same thing happened to my friend?" Walter turned from the window, his expression grave. "I think your friend found that cave, or something found him. Either way, he's not coming back, not as the man you knew. There has to be something we can do, some way to help him. Son, I've been living out here for 5 years, watching that thing spread. I've seen what comes out of those woods at night, heard the voices calling from the darkness. Your friend is gone. All that's left is something that wears his face and remembers his voice." The finality in his tone hit me like a physical blow. I'd known, on some level, that the David I'd known was gone, but hearing it stated so plainly made it real in a way that was almost unbearable. "How do I get home?" I asked finally. Walter pulled a map from a shelf and spread it on the table between us. "We're here," he said, pointing to a spot that seemed impossibly far from where I'd started. "The nearest road is about 40 miles southeast. I can give you supplies for the hike, but I can't take you there myself. Someone needs to stay and watch this place, make sure nothing else spreads beyond the dead zone." "You've been here alone for 5 years?" "Someone has to. The government knows about this place, but they can't do anything about it. So they pay me to be their eyes and ears, to file reports that nobody reads and watch for signs that the contamination is spreading." I studied the map, tracing the route Walter had marked for me. 40 miles through wilderness I didn't know, with limited supplies and no guarantee that whatever had taken David wouldn't follow me. "There's one more thing you need to know," Walter said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "The thing that took your friend, it doesn't just hunt randomly. It's smart, patient, and it's been learning." "Learning what?" "How to be human, how to mimic speech patterns, mannerisms, memories. The longer it has access to someone's mind, the better it gets at imitating them. By now, it probably knows everything your friend knew, including how to find his way back to civilization." The implication hit me like a sledgehammer. If the creature could perfectly imitate David, it could walk back into our normal lives and no one would know the difference. It could hurt our friends, our families, spread whatever corruption had claimed it to anyone it came into contact with. "I have to warn people," I said, starting to rise from my chair. Walter's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "Warn them about what? That your friend has been possessed by some ancient evil? That there's a dead zone in central Idaho where the laws of nature don't apply? Who's going to believe you?" He was right, of course. Even if I could somehow make it back to civilization, how could I explain what had happened without sounding completely insane? And if I did somehow convince people to listen, what then? There was no cavalry coming to save the day, no government agency equipped to deal with this kind of threat. So what do I do? Walter released my wrist and sat back in his chair. "You survive, son. You get out of here, and you go back to your life, and you try to forget this place exists. Because the alternative, staying here and trying to fight something you don't understand, that's just another way of dying." I wanted to argue, to insist that there had to be another way. But looking into Walter's eyes, seeing the weight of 5 years of isolation and helpless watching, I knew he was right. This was a battle that couldn't be won, only contained. That afternoon, Walter helped me prepare for the hike out. He gave me a better map, a compass that actually worked, and enough food and water for 3 days. He also gave me something else, a small leather pouch containing what he called protective symbols. "I don't know if they actually work," he admitted as he pressed the pouch into my hand, "but I copied them from some of the older petroglyphs in the area, the ones that predate the cave paintings. Might not hurt to carry them." As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and red, I prepared to leave. Part of me wanted to stay, to help Walter in his lonely vigil. But I knew he was right. I had a life to get back to, people who would worry if I disappeared. "One last thing," Walter said as I shouldered my pack. "If you ever see your friend again, the real David, not the thing that's wearing his face, you'll know it's not him if he tries to get you alone. The creatures from that place, they can't maintain the illusion around multiple witnesses. They need isolation to feed. I nodded, though the advice felt hollow. How could I ever trust my own perception again? How could I look at anyone and be certain they were who they claimed to be? The hike out took 3 days, just as Walter had predicted. I followed game trails and old logging roads, navigating by compass and keeping the sun at my back. The landscape gradually became more familiar, the twisted wrongness of the dead zone giving way to normal forest and finally to the kind of manicured wilderness that indicated human management. On the 3rd evening, I saw electric lights in the distance, a ranger station sitting beside a paved road. I'd never been so happy to see artificial illumination in my life. The rangers on duty were surprised to see me, especially when I told them I'd been lost for nearly a week. They wanted to organize a search party for David, but I convinced them to wait until morning, claiming he'd had experience with wilderness survival and might find his own way out. That night, lying in a real bed for the first time in over a week, I called David's sister to let her know he was missing. The conversation was one of the hardest things I've ever done, telling her that her brother had simply vanished into the wilderness and that the search teams might never find him. She cried, of course, and asked me again and again to explain exactly what had happened. I stuck to the story I'd prepared, that we'd gotten separated during a day hike and I hadn't been able to find him. It was close enough to the truth to be believable, but it left out everything that mattered. The official search for David lasted 2 weeks. They brought in helicopters, search dogs, volunteers from the local community. I participated when I could, though every moment in those mountains filled me with a terror I couldn't explain to anyone. The search teams never got close to the dead zone. Walter had been right about the government knowing to stay away from certain areas. Eventually, the search was called off. David was declared missing, presumed dead, and life slowly began to return to normal. I went back to my job, my apartment, my routine. But nothing was the same. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats, every unexpected sound made me jump. I found myself checking locks obsessively, avoiding places where I might be alone with strangers, studying the faces of everyone I met for signs of inhuman intelligence. The worst part was the dreams. Every night I found myself back in that twisted forest, listening to David's voice calling my name from the darkness. Sometimes the dreams felt so real that I would wake up expecting to find myself back in that nightmare landscape. 3 months after my return, I got a phone call that made my blood freeze. "Mike, it's David." The voice was perfect, exactly the right tone, the right cadence, even the slight rasp David had developed from years of smoking in college. If I hadn't seen what I'd seen in the mountains, I would have been overjoyed. "David," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Where are you? Everyone's been worried sick." "I made it out, Mike. Took me a while to find civilization, but I'm okay. A little worse for wear, but okay. I'm at a hospital in Boise. They want to keep me for observation for a few more days, but then I should be able to come home." That's wonderful," I said, my mind racing. "What happened to you? How did you survive?" "It's a long story. I'll tell you everything when I see you. But Mike, I need you to do me a favor. Don't tell anyone I called. I want to surprise everyone when I get back." The request sent ice through my veins. Walter's warning echoed in my mind. The creatures need isolation to feed. "Sure," I said. "Whatever you need." "Thanks, Mike. You're a good friend. I'll see you soon." The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone in horror. The thing that had taken David had learned to use technology, had somehow accessed his memories well enough to know my phone number and mimic his speech patterns perfectly. Worse, it was coming back to the city, back to all the people we knew. I thought about calling the police, but what would I tell them? That my supposedly dead friend had called me and I suspected he was actually some kind of shape-shifting monster? They'd have me committed. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I called Walter's satellite phone. "Morrison here," his gruff voice came through the static. "Walter, it's Mike Williams. The guy who... I remember you, son. What's wrong?" "It called me. The thing that took David. It's coming back to Boise, pretending to be him." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Walter spoke again, his voice was heavy with resignation. "I was afraid this might happen. The contamination is spreading, looking for new feeding grounds. Your friend was just the beginning. What do I do?" "Run," Walter said simply. "Get as far away from there as you can. Don't tell anyone where you're going. Don't use credit cards or anything that can be traced. Just disappear." "I can't just abandon everyone. What about David's family? Our friends?" "Son, listen to me very carefully. If that thing has learned to mimic your friend perfectly, then it has access to all his memories, all his relationships. It knows where everyone lives, where they work, who they care about. The only way to stop it from spreading is to starve it of victims. There has to be another way." "There is no other way." Walter's voice cracked with emotion. "Do you think I wanted to spend 5 years in isolation, watching that damn lake grow larger every month? Do you think I enjoy filing reports that nobody reads about threats nobody wants to acknowledge? I'm doing what I'm doing because there is no other choice." The line went quiet except for the hiss of static. When Walter spoke again, his voice was calmer but no less urgent. "Mike, I need you to understand something. This isn't just about your friend anymore. That thing is patient, intelligent, and absolutely committed to feeding. If you try to warn people, it'll know. If you try to fight it, it'll turn your own compassion against you. The only way to win is not to play." I knew he was right, but the thought of abandoning everyone I cared about was almost unbearable. "How long do I have?" "If it's in a hospital in Boise, probably a few days. Maybe a week if they're being thorough with their medical evaluation. Use that time to disappear completely. And then what? I hide for the rest of my life? You live, son. You start over somewhere far away and you build a new life. It's not perfect, but it's better than the alternative." That night, I began planning my disappearance. I withdrew cash from my bank accounts, sold my car for cash to a used dealer who didn't ask too many questions, and booked a one-way bus ticket to Seattle under a false name. I told my landlord I was taking a job overseas and needed to break my lease early. I called in sick to work and never went back. 3 days later, I was living in a cheap motel in the Capitol Hill district of Seattle, trying to figure out how to build a new identity from scratch. I'd been Michael Williams for 29 years, and suddenly I was nobody. No credit history, no employment record, no social connections. It was lonely and terrifying, but it was also liberating in a way I hadn't expected. For the first time since returning from the mountains, I felt like I could breathe freely. The constant sense of being watched began to fade, replaced by the simple challenges of day-to-day survival. I found work doing construction under the table, rented a studio apartment with cash, and slowly began to build something resembling a normal life. I cut my hair, grew a beard, and started going by my middle name, James. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me feel like a different person. For 6 months, I heard nothing from my old life. No news reports about strange deaths or disappearances in Boise, no attempts by the creature to track me down. I began to hope that maybe Walter had been wrong, that the thing had been content to simply replace David and live quietly in his place. Then I saw the news story. It was a small item on the local Seattle news, the kind of human interest piece they used to fill time at the end of the broadcast. A man from Boise named David Jones had become a local hero after organizing a camping trip for troubled teenagers that had supposedly helped them turn their lives around. The program was so successful that he was expanding it, taking groups of kids into the wilderness to teach them survival skills and self-reliance. The accompanying photo showed David's face, or rather, the perfect imitation of David's face that the creature was wearing. He was smiling, that same too-wide smile I'd seen in the mountains, surrounded by a group of teenagers who looked at him with obvious admiration and trust. I stared at the screen in horror, understanding immediately what was happening. The creature wasn't content to simply replace David. It was using his identity to access a steady supply of victims, isolated teenagers who wouldn't be missed right away, taken far from civilization where their disappearances could be explained as accidents or runaways. That night, I broke my own rules and called David's sister. "Sarah, it's Mike Williams." "Mike!" Her voice brightened immediately. "Oh my God, it's so good to hear from you. I've been wanting to call, but David said you were dealing with some personal issues and needed space." The confirmation that the creature had successfully integrated itself into David's life hit me like a physical blow. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to listen very carefully. Has David seemed different to you lately?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Different how?" "I don't know. Just not quite himself?" "Well, he's definitely changed since his accident in the mountains. He's more focused, more driven, and he's developed this passion for helping kids, which is wonderful but not really like the David I grew up with." "Why? Is something wrong?" "No," I said quickly. "I was just curious. He mentioned some kind of wilderness program for teenagers." "Oh, that. Yes, he's so excited about it. He's taking a group out next week, actually. Some kids from a youth center in Boise who've been having trouble with the law. David thinks a few days in the wilderness will help them find direction in their lives." I closed my eyes, feeling sick. That's great, Sarah. I'm happy for him." After I hung up, I sat in my small apartment staring at the wall, wrestling with an impossible decision. I could continue hiding, continue building my new life while the creature that wore David's face fed on innocent kids. Or I could try to stop it, knowing that doing so would almost certainly mean my death and might not save anyone. In the end, the decision made itself. I couldn't live with the knowledge that I'd allowed more people to die just to preserve my own safety. The next morning, I caught a bus back to Idaho. I had no plan beyond finding the creature and somehow stopping it. I didn't have weapons or special knowledge or supernatural allies, just the desperate conviction that I couldn't let more people die. It was probably a suicide mission, but it was the only choice I could live with. The bus dropped me off in Boise just as the sun was setting. According to the news story, the camping trip was scheduled to start the next morning from a trailhead about 50 miles north of the city. I rented a car with the fake ID I'd acquired in Seattle and drove through the night, arriving at the trailhead just before dawn. There were 3 vehicles in the parking area: a van with Boise Youth Center painted on the side, a pickup truck, and David's old Honda Civic. As I watched from the tree line, the creature that wore my friend's face emerged from the van, followed by 6 teenagers, 3 boys and 3 girls, all looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. "All right, everyone," the David thing said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "I know this isn't how you wanted to spend your weekend, but I promise you'll thank me for this experience. We're going to learn things about ourselves that we never knew." One of the kids, a sullen-looking boy with bleached hair, kicked at the gravel. "How long do we have to stay out here?" "Just 3 days," the creature replied with that too-wide smile. 3 days to discover who you really are." I watched from hiding as they shouldered their packs and headed into the wilderness. The creature moved with David's familiar gait, spoke with his voice, even wore the same battered hiking boots I remembered from our trip. If I hadn't seen what it really was, I would have been completely convinced. I waited until they were out of sight before emerging from the trees. I had no equipment beyond what I'd been able to buy at a sporting goods store the night before: a basic pack, some food, a sleeping bag, and a hunting knife. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. The trail they'd taken was well marked, leading into the same mountain range where David and I had started our fateful trip months earlier. I followed at a distance, careful to stay out of sight while keeping close enough to track their progress. By late afternoon, I could hear voices ahead. The creature and its victim setting up camp in a meadow beside a small stream. I found a position on a ridge overlooking their site and settled in to watch, trying to figure out how to proceed. The teenagers seemed to be warming up to their guide, laughing at his jokes and listening attentively as he showed them how to set up tents and start a fire. The creature was playing its role perfectly, coming across as enthusiastic but not overly friendly, knowledgeable but not condescending. As darkness fell, they gathered around the campfire, and the creature began telling stories about wilderness survival and the importance of self-reliance. The kids were obviously engaged, no longer the sullen group I'd seen that morning. The wilderness teaches us things about ourselves that we can't learn anywhere else, the David thing was saying. Out here, stripped of all the distractions and comforts of modern life, we discover our true nature. "What's your true nature?" asked one of the girls, a redhead with multiple piercings. The creature's smile widened just a fraction too much. "I'm still learning that myself, Emma. But I think my nature is to help others find their own paths, even if those paths lead to places they never expected to go." Listening to it speak, I was struck by how perfectly it had mastered David's mannerisms, his speech patterns, even his philosophy about outdoor education. But underneath the familiar surface, I could hear something else. A hunger barely contained, a predatory patience that made my skin crawl. I was trying to figure out how to warn the kids without exposing myself when one of them, a thin boy with nervous eyes, announced he needed to use the bathroom. "Just head into the trees," the creature said casually, "but don't go too far. The woods can be confusing at night." The boy grabbed a flashlight and headed toward my position. I quickly moved away from the ridge, not wanting to be discovered, but I could hear him crashing through the underbrush below me. Then, suddenly, the sound stopped. I waited, listening, but heard nothing. The boy's flashlight beam was no longer visible through the trees. Down at the campfire, the conversation continued normally for several minutes before the creature looked around and frowned. "Where's Marcus? He should have been back by now." "Maybe he got lost," suggested one of the other kids. "I'll go find him," the creature said, standing up. "Everyone stay here and keep the fire going. I'll be right back." As soon as it disappeared into the trees, I knew the feeding had begun. I moved as quickly and quietly as I could, trying to intercept the creature before it could reach its victim. But the woods were dark and unfamiliar, and I could hear nothing beyond the normal sounds of the forest. After 20 minutes of frantic searching, I found the boy's flashlight lying on the ground beside a game trail. There was no sign of Marcus himself, but the earth around the flashlight looked disturbed, as if there had been a struggle. "Marcus," the creature's voice called from somewhere deeper in the woods. "Marcus, where are you?" The voice was perfectly normal, showing no sign of the inhuman hunger I'd heard months ago. But I knew better now. I knew that the creature was patient, clever, and perfectly capable of maintaining its human facade even while it fed. I followed the sound of its voice, moving through the trees as quietly as possible. Eventually, I found myself at the edge of another clearing, this one dominated by a circle of standing stones similar to the ones I'd encountered during my original escape. The creature stood in the center of the circle, no longer bothering to maintain its human appearance. Its skin had taken on that same grayish pallor. Its eyes were black pits, and its mouth was stretched wide to reveal rows of needle-sharp teeth. At its feet lay Marcus, unconscious but apparently unharmed. "I know you're out there, Mike," the creature said without turning around. "I can smell your fear. Still trying to play the hero?" I stepped into the clearing, my hand tight on the grip of my hunting knife. "Let the boy go." The creature laughed, the sound echoing off the surrounding stones. "Which boy? They're all mine now, Mike, the whole group. I'm going to feed on them slowly, one by one, savoring their terror and pain, and there's nothing you can do to stop me." "We'll see about that." I charged forward, knife raised, but the creature moved with inhuman speed. One moment it was standing over Marcus, the next it was beside me, its clawed hand wrapping around my throat and lifting me off the ground. "You always were too sentimental," it said in David's voice. "That's what made you so easy to manipulate. Did you really think I didn't know you were following us? Did you think I couldn't smell your pathetic attempt at heroism from miles away?" It squeezed, and stars exploded across my vision. I tried to stab it with the knife, but its other hand caught my wrist and twisted until I heard bones crack. "I'm going to keep you alive for a while," it whispered, its breath hot against my face. I want you to watch as I feed on each of those children. I want you to know that their deaths are your fault, just like David's transformation was your fault." Through the haze of pain and oxygen deprivation, I managed to speak. "David is still in there." The creature's grip loosened slightly. "What did you say?" "You told me, in the mountains, that David was still inside, screaming." Something flickered across the creature's inhuman features. Uncertainty, maybe, or fear. Its grip loosened further. "If he's still there," I gasped, "then he can hear me. David, remember who you are. Remember what you cared about." The creature snarled and tightened its grip again, but I could see doubt in its black eyes. "He's gone. I consumed him months ago." "Then why do you still use his voice? Why do you still remember his memories? Why do you care about helping kids?" For a moment, the creature's face seemed to ripple, David's familiar features briefly visible beneath the monstrous exterior. Its grip loosened again, and I managed to take a breath. "David," I said more clearly, "I know you're in there. I know you can fight this thing. Remember the night before we left for the mountains? You said this trip was about finding ourselves. Well, find yourself now. Take back control." The creature's entire body began to convulse, its form shifting between David's appearance and the monstrous thing it had become. When it spoke, its voice was a mixture of David's familiar tones and the alien hunger that had replaced him. "Mike? Mike, is that really you? I can't control it. It's so hungry, and it's been feeding on me for so long. Fight it, Dave. You're stronger than this thing. I can't. It's too powerful. It's been growing stronger every time it feeds." The creature's form stabilized back into its monstrous shape, and its grip on my throat tightened again. "Enough! The host is weak. I am eternal." But I could see the cracks in its control now, the way David's personality was fighting to reassert itself. And I remembered something Walter had told me about the protective symbols he'd given me. With my free hand, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the leather pouch containing the petroglyphs Walter had copied. The moment my fingers touched the symbols, the creature screamed and released me, stumbling backward as if it had been burned. "What is that?" it snarled, its form flickering between David and monster. I opened the pouch and pulled out one of the small stones bearing the ancient symbols. The creature recoiled further, its entire body now shifting rapidly between forms. "These are older than your hunger," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. "They were created to protect against things like you." The creature's form finally stabilized into something that was neither fully David nor fully monster. A horrible hybrid that retained David's face but with black eyes and too many teeth. "You think some primitive scratches on rocks can stop me? I am older than this mountain, older than the trees." But its voice lacked conviction, and I could see genuine fear in its inhuman eyes. I took a step forward, holding the stone like a talisman. "Maybe they can't stop you," I said, "but they can weaken you enough for David to break free." I pressed the stone against the creature's forehead, and the effect was immediate. It screamed, a sound that was part rage and part anguish, and collapsed to its knees. Its form began shifting rapidly, cycling between David's appearance and various monstrous configurations. "David," I shouted, "now, while it's weak, take back control." For a moment, the creature's form stabilized into David's familiar face, though the eyes remained black. When it spoke, it was clearly my friend's voice, though strained with effort and pain. "Mike, I can feel it fighting me, but I think I can hold it back for a few minutes. You have to get the kids out of here, take them back to the cars and get as far away as possible." "What about you?" "I can't leave this place, Mike. The thing is part of me now. If I try to go back to civilization, it'll just break free again and hurt more people. I have to stay here. There has to be another way." "There isn't." David's voice cracked with emotion. "I can feel it trying to regain control. Please, Mike, save the kids. Don't let my death be for nothing." I wanted to argue, to insist that we could find some way to save him, but looking into his eyes, still black but now filled with human emotion rather than alien hunger, I knew he was right. This was the best outcome we could hope for. "I'm sorry, Dave," I said. "I'm sorry I got you into this." He managed a weak smile that was purely human. "We both got into this, Mike. We made our choices. Now make the right choice and get out of here." I picked up the unconscious Marcus and slung him over my shoulder. As I started to leave the clearing, David called out one last time. "Mike, tell my sister. Tell her I went out doing something good, okay? Tell her I was helping kids." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and carried Marcus back toward the camp. Behind me, I could hear David screaming as the creature fought to regain control. The other 5 teenagers were exactly where the creature had left them, sitting around the fire and looking increasingly worried about their missing companions. When I stumbled into the firelight carrying Marcus, they jumped to their feet in alarm. "Who are you?" demanded the redhead, Emma. "Where's David? What happened to Marcus?" "My name is Mike Williams," I said, setting Marcus down near the fire. He was beginning to regain consciousness. "David sent me to get you all out of here. There's been an accident." "What kind of accident?" asked one of the boys. I thought quickly, knowing that the truth would only cause panic. "David fell and hit his head. He's hurt pretty badly, and Marcus got lost trying to find help. We need to get everyone back to the cars right now." The kids looked skeptical, but the urgency in my voice seemed to convince them. Within 15 minutes, they had broken camp and were following me back down the trail toward the parking area. We hiked through the night, the teenagers grumbling but complying with my insistence that we keep moving. By dawn, we'd reached the cars. I loaded everyone into the youth center van and drove them back to Boise, stopping only once to call the authorities and report that David had been injured in a climbing accident. The official search for David lasted 3 days, but they never found his body. The investigators concluded that he'd probably fallen into one of the many deep crevasses in the area, and after a week, the search was called off. He was declared missing, presumed dead, which was close enough to the truth. At the memorial service, I sat in the back and listened to person after person talk about the David they remembered, the loyal friend, the dedicated outdoorsman, the man who had died trying to help troubled kids find their way. Sarah gave a beautiful eulogy about her brother's compassion and his commitment to making the world a better place. Nobody mentioned the thing that had worn his face for 6 months, the creature that had killed at least one innocent boy and would have killed 5 more if given the chance. That secret died with David in the mountains, and I've carried it alone ever since. I stayed in Boise for another week, helping Sarah sort through David's affairs and trying to provide what comfort I could. The hardest part was maintaining the fiction that he'd been the same person throughout the months after our original camping trip. Sarah had dozens of photos of him from that period, and in every one the creature had perfectly replicated his smile, his posture, his mannerisms. Looking at those photos, knowing what I knew, was almost unbearable. Eventually, I returned to Seattle and my new life as James Morrison. I kept the name partly out of habit and partly as a tribute to Walter, the lonely guardian who was still keeping watch over the dead zone in central Idaho. I never contacted him again, but sometimes I wondered if he was still out there, filing reports that nobody read and watching for signs of spreading contamination. The teenagers from the camping trip all seemed to recover from their experience without lasting trauma. As far as they knew, they'd simply been on a wilderness excursion that had ended early due to an accident. Marcus remembered nothing of his encounter with the creature, which was probably for the best. But I remembered everything. Every detail of those nightmarish days was burned into my memory with perfect clarity. I remembered the sound of David's voice calling from the darkness, the feeling of the creature's clawed hand around my throat, the moment when my friend had briefly broken free of the thing that had consumed him. Most of all, I remembered the choice David had made in those final moments, to sacrifice himself rather than allow the creature to hurt more innocent people. It was the most heroic thing I'd ever witnessed, and nobody would ever know about it except me. That was 3 years ago. I've built a good life for myself in Seattle, working as a carpenter and slowly developing friendships with people who know nothing about my past. I sleep better now, though I still have nightmares about twisted forests and hungry things that wear familiar faces. Sometimes I think about going back to Idaho, about checking on Walter or visiting the memorial plaque that Sarah had placed at the trailhead where David died. But I know that way lies madness. The past is past, and the best I can do is honor David's sacrifice by living the life he helped save. Still, there are moments, usually late at night when I'm alone with my thoughts, when I wonder if the creature really died with David, or if it's still out there somewhere, patient and hungry, wearing a new face and learning new ways to hunt. On those nights, I check the locks on my doors and windows, and I keep the remaining protective stones close at hand, because if there's one thing I learned in those mountains, it's that there are things in the darkness that are older and hungrier than human understanding, and the only thing standing between them and the innocent is the willingness of ordinary people to make extraordinary sacrifices. David made that sacrifice. He chose to die rather than let the thing inside him hurt more people. And if the time ever comes when I have to make a similar choice, I hope I'll have the courage to follow his example. Until then, I carry his memory and his secret, and I try to live a life worthy of the price he paid to protect it. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Sawtooth National Recreation Area, deep in the Idaho wilderness, during what was supposed to be a simple 3-day camping trip with my closest friends. I should have known something was wrong from the moment we crossed the bridge over the Salmon River. The water below looked darker than it should have, almost black despite the afternoon sun, and there was this smell, like copper pennies mixed with something rotting. But we were all so excited to finally get away from our cubicles in Boise that I pushed the unease aside. There were 4 of us, myself, my roommate David Jones, and our friends from college, Jennifer Williams and Robert Johnson. We'd been planning this trip for months, ever since Jen found this supposedly pristine camping spot near Crescent Lake on some obscure hiking forum. The post described it as untouched by modern civilization and a place where you can truly disconnect. What it didn't mention was why it remained so untouched. The drive up Forest Service Road 214 took longer than expected. Our GPS kept glitching, showing us in the middle of empty space one moment, then placing us miles away the next. David, ever the optimist, joked that we were entering a dead zone. "Good," Jen said from the back seat, her auburn hair catching the filtered sunlight through the windshield. "That's exactly what we need." She'd been stressed lately. Her marketing job was eating her alive, and her relationship with her boyfriend had just ended messily. This trip was her escape. Robert, quiet and methodical as always, navigated using an old paper map he'd picked up at the ranger station. "Turn left at the lightning-struck pine," he read aloud, squinting at the faded markings. "Should be about 2 miles to the trailhead." The lightning-struck pine was impossible to miss. A massive ponderosa split clean down the middle, its blackened trunk reaching toward the sky like gnarled fingers. Something about it made my skin crawl, the way it stood there like a monument to violence. Dead ravens hung from several of its branches, their bodies mummified by the dry mountain air. When I mentioned it, David just shrugged. "Mountain storms are brutal up here." We parked at what barely qualified as a trailhead. Really, just a widened spot in the dirt road marked by a rusted metal sign so weathered the text was illegible. The forest pressed in immediately, dense stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir creating a canopy so thick that noon felt like dusk. Our plan was to hike the 3 miles to Crescent Lake, set up camp, and spend 2 nights completely off-grid. The trail started well-maintained but deteriorated quickly. Within a mile, we were scrambling over fallen logs and pushing through undergrowth that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in years. The silence was the first thing I noticed. No birds, no insects, just the sound of our boots on pine needles and our increasingly labored breathing. "This place gives me the creeps," Jen said, swatting at what she thought was a spider web across the trail. But when I looked, there was nothing there. "It's just quiet," Robert replied, but I caught him glancing nervously at the trees. Remote places always feel different. David was a few yards ahead, his red backpack bright against the muted greens and browns of the forest. He stopped suddenly and held up his hand. "Do you guys hear that?" We all froze, straining our ears. At first, there was nothing. Then, faintly, I heard it. A sound like whispering, carried on a wind that didn't exist. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakably urgent, almost desperate. "Probably just wind through the trees," Robert said, but his voice was tight. The whispering stopped as abruptly as it had started. We pressed on, eager to reach the lake before dark. The trail wound through increasingly dense forest, and I began to notice things that didn't belong. Scratches on tree trunks, too deep and too regular to be from animal claws. Piles of stones arranged in perfect circles as if someone had been marking territory. And everywhere, that copper smell, growing stronger as we climbed. Crescent Lake, when we finally reached it, was nothing like the forum post had described. Instead of pristine mountain water reflecting snow-capped peaks, we found a dark, still body of water that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The shoreline was ringed with dead trees, their bare branches reaching into the water like skeletal hands. Even the air felt different here, thicker, harder to breathe. "Well," David said, trying to inject some enthusiasm into his voice, "it's definitely remote." We set up camp in a small clearing about 50 yards from the water's edge. The ground was soft with decades of pine needles, but underneath I could feel something harder, rocks arranged in patterns that seemed deliberate. While we worked, the sun disappeared behind the mountains with alarming speed, plunging us into a premature twilight. That first night should have been our warning. We built a fire in a ring of stones that was already there, old, established with char marks that went deep into the earth. The flames danced normally at first, crackling and popping as fires do, but as darkness fell complete, the flames began to change. They flickered blue-green, then pure blue, casting strange shadows that moved independently of the wind. "Mineral deposits in the wood," Robert said, but he moved his sleeping bag farther from the fire. Around midnight, the whispering started again. This time, it seemed to come from multiple directions. A symphony of urgent voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood the malevolent intent behind. Jen was the first to sit up in her sleeping bag. "Are you guys hearing this?" she whispered. We all were. The voices grew louder, more insistent, and I swear I could make out words. Pleas, warnings, commands. The fire responded to the sounds, flaring higher when the voices peaked, dimming to embers when they fell to murmurs. "It's just the wind," David said, but he'd unzipped his sleeping bag and was reaching for the flashlight. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the voices. Absolute, oppressive, like the world was holding its breath. None of us slept well that night. Morning brought no relief. The air was thick with mist that clung to the water's surface, and our gear was damp with a condensation that felt oily against the skin. When David went to restart the fire for coffee, he found our stack of carefully gathered firewood scattered in a perfect circle around the dead embers. Each piece was placed with mathematical precision, points facing inward like the spokes of a wheel. "Animals," Robert suggested, but we all knew no animal could arrange wood with such deliberate intent. Jen was quiet during breakfast, picking at her oatmeal and staring at the lake. When I asked if she was okay, she turned to me with eyes that seemed older than they had the day before. "I dreamed about this place," she said, "before we came here. The same lake, the same dead trees. There was someone in the water, calling my name." David laughed nervously. "Prophetic dreams now? Come on, Jen." "I'm serious." Her voice was flat, emotionless. "In the dream, I walked into the water. It was warm, and there were hands reaching up from the bottom, but they weren't trying to pull me down. They were trying to warn me." The conversation died there, leaving us to break camp in uncomfortable silence. Our plan for the second day was to explore the area around the lake, maybe do some fishing if the water looked promising. But as we made our way along the shoreline, it became clear that nothing lived in those dark waters. No insects skimmed the surface, no fish rose to feed, no water birds disturbed the perfect stillness. It was as if the lake existed in its own bubble of death. The dead trees were the worst part. Up close, I could see that they hadn't died naturally. The bark was stripped away in spirals, exposing wood that was perfectly white, bleached clean. Some had symbols carved into them, angular marks that hurt to look at directly, as if my eyes couldn't quite process their geometry. "We should go back," Robert said. He'd been growing increasingly agitated as we walked, checking his watch constantly, even though time had become meaningless in this place where the sun never seemed to move. "Just a little farther," David called from ahead. He'd found what looked like a trail leading away from the lake, up into the hills. "There's something up here." Against my better judgment, we followed him. The trail led to a clearing about half a mile from the lake, where the remains of a structure stood among overgrown vegetation. It might have been a cabin once, but now only the stone foundation and parts of 2 walls remained. Rusted metal objects littered the ground. Tools, maybe, or weapons. Everything was coated in that same oily moisture we'd found on our gear. In the center of the ruins was a well. The stones around its mouth were carved with the same disturbing symbols we'd seen on the trees, and from its depths came a smell that made my stomach turn. Not decay, exactly, but something far worse, the smell of things that should be dead but weren't. "Jesus," Jen whispered, covering her nose with her sleeve. "What is that?" David was already leaning over the well's edge, shining his flashlight into the darkness. "I can't see the bottom," he said, "but there's something down there, something moving." That's when we heard the first scream. It came from the direction of our camp, high and desperate and unmistakably human. We ran through the forest, crashing through undergrowth and leaping over fallen logs, driven by panic and the terrible certainty that something had found our little sanctuary by the lake. But when we reached the clearing, everything was exactly as we'd left it. Our tents stood undisturbed, our gear laid out in neat rows. The fire ring was cold and empty, just as we'd left it. There was no sign that anyone, or anything, had been there. "Maybe it was an animal," Robert suggested, but his voice shook. "That was human," Jen said. "That was definitely human." We spent the rest of the day jumping at shadows, unable to shake the feeling that we were being watched. The trees seemed closer than before, the shadows deeper. Even David had lost his optimism, staying close to the group and speaking in whispers. As evening approached, we faced a choice: spend another night by the lake or hike back to the car in the dark. The thought of navigating that deteriorated trail by flashlight was terrifying, but somehow staying felt worse. "One more night," David said. "In the morning, we'll pack up early and get out of here." That second night was when everything went wrong. We built the fire bigger this time, piling on enough wood to keep it burning until dawn. The flames danced their unnatural blue again, but we'd grown almost accustomed to it. We played cards by the fire's light, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy, but conversation was stilted and nervous. Around 10 o'clock, David excused himself to use the bathroom. Really, just a trip into the trees beyond our camp. We heard his footsteps crashing through the underbrush, then silence. 5 minutes passed, then 10. "David?" Robert called. No answer. We waited another few minutes before grabbing flashlights and heading into the forest. We found his trail easily enough, broken branches and disturbed pine needles leading away from camp. But after about 100 yards, the trail simply ended. Not at a cliff or a stream or any natural barrier. It just stopped, as if David had simply vanished into thin air. "David!" Jen shouted, her voice echoing through the trees. "This isn't funny." We searched for hours, calling his name until our voices were hoarse, but found nothing. No more tracks, no sign of struggle, no indication of where he might have gone. It was as if the forest had simply swallowed him whole. By dawn, we were frantic. Robert wanted to hike back to the car and get help, but Jen refused to leave without David. We compromised by setting up a signal fire, a huge blaze that sent a column of smoke high above the tree line. If there were any Forest Service personnel in the area, they'd see it. But as the sun climbed higher, our signal fire began to behave strangely. The smoke, instead of rising straight up, began to spiral downward, forming a helix pattern that defied physics. The flames themselves seemed to move with purpose, reaching toward the lake as if drawn by some invisible force. "That's not natural," Robert said. His face was pale and I could see his hands shaking as he adjusted his glasses. That's when we heard David calling. His voice came from the direction of the lake, faint but unmistakably his. "Guys, over here, I need help." We ran toward the sound, crashing through the underbrush in our eagerness to find our missing friend. But when we reached the shoreline, there was no one there. Just that perfectly still dark water reflecting the cloudy sky. "David," Jen called, "where are you?" "Here." The voice seemed to come from the water itself. "I'm hurt. I need help." Something was floating about 20 feet from shore, a dark shape that might have been a head bobbing in the water. Without thinking, Jen started wading in, her boots splashing in the shallows. "Jen, don't!" Robert grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "Something's wrong." She struggled against his grip. "That's David. He's drowning." But as we watched, the shape in the water began to change. It elongated, stretching like taffy, and I realized it wasn't a head at all. It was something else, something that had learned to mimic David's voice but couldn't quite master his form. "Guys, please." The voice was still David's, but coming from this writhing, impossible shape in the water. "It hurts. Help me." The thing began moving toward shore, and as it got closer I could see it more clearly. It was vaguely human-shaped, but wrong in every detail. Too many joints, fingers that bent in directions fingers shouldn't bend. A face that was almost David's, but stretched and distorted like a reflection in warped glass. We backed away from the water's edge, but the thing kept coming, pulling itself onto the rocky shore with movements that made my stomach lurch. When it spoke again, David's voice came from a mouth that was too wide, filled with too many teeth. "Why won't you help me?" it asked, tilting its head at an angle that would have broken a human neck. "I'm your friend." That's when Robert snapped. He grabbed a large rock from the shoreline and hurled it at the thing, catching it in what might have been its chest. The impact produced a sound like wet meat hitting concrete, and the creature let out a shriek that was nothing like David's voice, high and piercing and full of rage. "Run!" Robert shouted, and we did. We crashed through the forest, branches tearing at our clothes and faces, driven by pure terror. Behind us I could hear the thing giving chase, its movements creating sounds no human body should make. Bones popping, joints grinding, wet sliding noises that spoke of something fundamentally wrong with its anatomy. We made it back to camp and started throwing our essential gear into backpacks with shaking hands. The tent could stay. We needed to get to the car and get out of this place before that thing caught up with us. But as we prepared to leave, we heard David's voice again, this time from the edge of our clearing. "Guys, what's wrong? Why are you packing?" We turned to see David standing at the tree line, looking exactly like himself. No distortion, no wrong angles, just our friend with a confused expression on his face. He looked tired and disheveled, as if he'd spent the night sleeping rough but otherwise perfectly normal. "David," Jen took a hesitant step toward him. "Where have you been? We've been looking for you all night." He blinked slowly, as if processing the question. "I went to take a leak and got turned around. Spent the night under a tree. Why? What's wrong?" Robert and I exchanged glances. This David looked right, sounded right, moved right. But, after what we'd seen at the lake, how could we be sure? "We saw something in the water," I said carefully. "Something that looked like you." David laughed, but the sound was slightly off. Too forced, too long. Looked like me. What do you mean? It spoke with your voice, Jen said. She was studying his face intently, searching for any sign that this wasn't really him. Called for help. Well, that's weird, David said. His smile was perfect, exactly the way David smiled. But something about his eyes was wrong. They were too still, too focused, like a predator watching prey. Must have been an echo or something. Sound travels strangely out here. He moved toward his backpack, and that's when I noticed that his footsteps made no sound on the pine needles. David was a heavy guy, clumsy on his feet, but this version moved with a fluid grace that was entirely unlike him. David, I said slowly, what's the name of your dog back home? He paused in his packing and looked up at me with that too-still stare. What kind of question is that, Mike? Just answer it. Buster, he said without hesitation. David had never owned a dog. He was allergic. The thing wearing David's face must have seen the recognition in my eyes because its expression changed. The friendly confusion fell away, replaced by something cold and hungry. When it smiled, I saw that its teeth were just slightly too sharp, too numerous. You're very observant, Michael, it said, and David's voice carried an undertone like wind through dead leaves. But not observant enough. That's when I realized we'd made a terrible mistake. We'd assumed there was only one of them. Behind us, Jen screamed. I spun around to see another David standing at the opposite edge of the clearing, this one's head tilted at that impossible angle, and beyond him, another, and another. The forest was full of David shapes, all standing perfectly still, all wearing that same cold smile. We've been waiting for you, they said in unison, their voices creating a harmony that hurt to hear. Waiting so long for fresh faces, fresh voices, fresh shapes to wear. Robert grabbed a burning branch from our fire and held it out like a weapon. Stay back, he shouted, but his voice cracked with terror. The David things laughed, dozens of identical laughs that echoed through the trees. Fire, one of them said. How quaint. Do you think fire will save you? As if responding to some unheard signal, they all began moving toward us at once. Their movements were still wrong, too fluid, too coordinated, but they were fast, impossibly fast. The trail, I shouted. Make for the trail. We ran, but the David things were everywhere, emerging from behind trees and rocks, cutting off our escape routes. Every direction we turned, we found another perfect replica of our friend, each one wearing that predatory smile. But in the chaos, I noticed something. They weren't trying to catch us. They were hurting us, driving us back toward the lake. They want us at the water, I called to the others. Don't let them push us back. We changed direction, fighting our way uphill through dense underbrush. Behind us, the David things gave chase, but their movements became less coordinated the farther we got from the lake. Whatever they were, the water was their source of power. We fought our way through thorn bushes and over fallen logs, driven by pure adrenaline and the sounds of pursuit behind us. I could hear them calling to us in David's voice, pleading for us to stop, to come back, to not leave them alone in the dark. But gradually the voices grew fainter. The sounds of pursuit faded. By the time we reached the old cabin ruins, we could no longer hear them at all. We didn't stop to catch our breath. The three of us, the three real, human survivors, pushed on through the forest, following what we hoped was the trail back to our car. The sun was setting again, and the thought of spending another night in those woods filled me with a terror so pure it was almost paralyzing. But the trail seemed longer than before, much longer. We walked for hours in the fading light, and I began to worry that we were lost, that the things from the lake had somehow altered the landscape to trap us. Then Robert stopped abruptly. "Listen," he whispered. At first, I heard nothing. Then, faintly, the sound of an engine, a car engine, running rough and ready to stall. We ran toward the sound, crashing through the last stretch of forest to find our car exactly where we'd left it, still parked at that pitiful excuse for a trailhead. But something was wrong. The engine was running, the headlights were on, and behind the wheel sat David. He waved at us cheerfully as we emerged from the tree line, as if nothing had happened. "There you guys are." I was starting to worry. Car wouldn't start at first, but I got her going. The three of us stood frozen at the edge of the forest. This David looked perfect, exactly right in every detail, but we'd left him back at the lake, surrounded by dozens of his own copies. "Come on," he called. "It's getting dark. We should head back to town." Jen took a step toward the car, then stopped. "David," she said carefully, "what did you have for breakfast yesterday morning, before we left Boise?" David's smile flickered for just a moment. "Eggs," he said. "Scrambled eggs." It was the right answer. David always had scrambled eggs for breakfast, but something about the way he said it, too quick, too certain, made my skin crawl. "Get in the car," Robert whispered to me and Jen. "But be ready to run." We approached the vehicle slowly, every muscle tense. David's smile never wavered, but I noticed he wasn't blinking. At all. As we reached the car, I caught a glimpse of the back seat. It was covered in what looked like David's clothes, shirt, jeans, hiking boots, but they were empty, deflated, as if whatever had been wearing them had simply evaporated. "David," I said, my hand on the door handle, "where's your hiking pack?" He turned to look at me, and for just a moment his face rippled like water. "What pack?" he asked. I yanked the car door open and dove into the back seat, shouting for the others to follow. But instead of David behind the wheel, I found myself staring at something that might have been human once, but had been stretched and twisted into a parody of human form. Its skin was pale and translucent, showing dark veins underneath, and its eyes were completely black. It lunged for me with fingers that were too long and too many, but Robert was already there with the burning branch from our fire. He thrust it into the thing's face, and it let out that same inhuman shriek we'd heard at the lake. The creature released me and writhed backward, its form losing cohesion like smoke in wind. Through the windshield I could see more of them emerging from the forest, dozens of pale, shifting shapes that might have been human once. "The keys!" Jen shouted. "Where are the keys?" I felt around frantically until my fingers closed on metal. The real David must have hidden them under the seat before whatever happened to him happened. I slid into the driver's seat as the others piled in and turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. Outside, the things from the lake pressed against the windows, their faces shifting and changing, trying on different expressions like masks. Some looked like David, others like people I'd never seen but who might have been previous visitors to this cursed place. I tried the engine again. Nothing. "Please," Jen whispered, "please start." On the third try, the engine caught. I threw the car in reverse and hit the gas, feeling the satisfying crunch as we ran over several of the creatures. They scattered like mist, reforming seconds later, but it bought us enough time to get the car turned around. We raced down the mountain road, headlights cutting through gathering darkness, the speedometer hovering near dangerous speeds for the winding dirt track. In the rearview mirror, I could see shapes pursuing us, moving too fast to be human, flowing like liquid shadow between the trees. But gradually, they fell behind. As we put distance between ourselves and that cursed lake, the things seemed to lose their power to maintain physical form. By the time we reached the paved road, there was nothing behind us but ordinary darkness. We drove straight through to Boise, not stopping except for gas. None of us spoke during the trip. What could we say? That our friend had been replaced by some shape-shifting horror? That we'd abandoned him to creatures that shouldn't exist? It wasn't until we were back in the city, surrounded by electric lights and traffic and all the comforting sounds of civilization, that any of us dared to speak. "We have to report this," Robert said. His voice was hoarse from fear and exhaustion. "David is missing. People need to know. But what could we tell them? That our friend had been taken by monsters from a lake that probably didn't exist on any official map. They'd think we were crazy. Or worse, they'd think we'd killed David ourselves and were making up an elaborate story to cover it up." In the end, we agreed on a simpler version. David had gone for a walk and never came back. We'd searched for him, called for help, but found no trace. It was close enough to the truth to be believable. The search and rescue operation lasted 3 days. They brought dogs, helicopters, volunteers from the community. They found our campsite by the lake, just as we'd left it. They found no trace of David. What they did find was disturbing enough. The dogs refused to go near the water. The helicopter pilot reported radio equipment malfunctioning when flying over the lake. 2 of the search volunteers claimed to have heard voices calling for help from the water, but when they investigated, they found nothing. After 3 days, the search was called off. David Jones was officially listed as missing, presumed dead due to misadventure. Case closed. But I know the truth. David isn't dead, at least not in any way that matters. He's still out there, by that dark lake, wearing whatever face the creatures decide to give him. Maybe he's aware, trapped inside his own body while something else wears his skin. Maybe he's been absorbed completely, his memories and personality becoming just another tool for the things in the water to use. Sometimes, late at night, my phone rings. When I answer, I hear David's voice on the other end, calling my name, asking me to come back, asking me to bring more friends. I've changed my number 3 times, but the calls keep coming. Jen moved to Seattle a month after the trip. She said she needed a fresh start, somewhere far from Idaho and its dark lakes. But 2 weeks ago, she called me, crying. She'd been hiking in the Olympic Mountains and found a lake that looked familiar. Too familiar. She described the same dead trees, the same oily mist, the same absolute silence. "They're spreading, Mike," she whispered into the phone. "Or maybe they were always everywhere and we just never knew how to see them." Robert hasn't been the same since we came back. He quit his job, stopped leaving his apartment, spends his days researching folklore and legends about shape-shifting entities. His apartment is covered with maps marked with red X's, locations where people have gone missing near bodies of water, places where search and rescue operations have been mysteriously unsuccessful. "There's a pattern," he told me last time I visited. "These things, whatever they are, they've been hunting for centuries, maybe longer, and they're getting bolder. I try to go on with my normal life, but it's impossible. How do you forget something like that? How do you trust that the people around you are really human when you've seen how perfectly these things can mimic us?" Last week, I was at a coffee shop downtown when I saw him. David. He was sitting at a corner table looking exactly as he had the morning we'd started our hike. Same clothes, same expression, same everything. He looked up when I entered, smiled that familiar smile, and waved me over. I ran. I ran like a coward, leaving my coffee order behind, pushing through the crowd of confused customers. When I looked back from the safety of my car, he was gone. But I know he'll be back. They always come back. The things in the lake are patient. They have all the time in the world, and they know that eventually people forget. Eventually, new hikers will find that forum post about the pristine camping spot near Crescent Lake. Eventually, fresh faces will make their way up that deteriorated trail, drawn by the promise of disconnection and solitude. And the cycle will begin again. I've thought about going back, taking a gun, maybe some explosives, anything that might hurt these creatures or destroy their nesting place. But deep down, I know it wouldn't matter. The lake is just one of many. These things are older than our civilization, and they'll be here long after we're gone. All I can do is tell this story and hope that someone, somewhere, will listen. If you ever find yourself planning a camping trip to a remote lake in Idaho, or anywhere else for that matter, check the reports carefully. Look for the warning signs, missing hikers, equipment malfunctions, stories that don't quite add up. And if you see a forum post about a pristine camping spot that's untouched by modern civilization, run. Run as far and as fast as you can, because some places are untouched for a reason. My name is Michael Williams, and I'm telling you this because David would have wanted someone to know the truth. He would have wanted his story told, even if no one believes it. The things at Crescent Lake are still hunting, they're still waiting, and they're very, very hungry. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Sawtooth Wilderness of central Idaho, near the remote settlement of Stanley, where the jagged peaks pierce the sky like broken teeth and the ancient pines hold secrets darker than their shadows. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day camping trip. Jake Morrison, my college roommate, had been planning this for months, a chance to disconnect from our soul-crushing marketing jobs in Boise and remember what it felt like to be alive. He'd recruited our old crew, Sarah Rodriguez, the adventure photographer who could find beauty in a garbage dump, Tom Baker, the eternal optimist who treated every setback like a minor inconvenience, and Lisa Gonzalez, the pragmatic nurse whose medical training made her our unofficial safety officer. The Whispering Pines Trail, Jake had said, spreading the topographical map across his kitchen table like a treasure chart. Barely marked, hardly used. We'll have the whole wilderness to ourselves. That should have been our first warning. We started our hike at dawn on a crisp October morning, the air sharp enough to cut glass. The trailhead sat at the end of a deteriorating logging road, marked only by a weathered wooden sign that read, Whispering Pines, 12 miles. The lettering was so faded I had to trace it with my finger to make out the words. Cheerful, Sarah muttered, adjusting her camera strap. She was already taking pictures, the mechanical click of her shutter echoing strangely in the morning stillness. The first few hours passed without incident. We fell into our familiar rhythm, Jake leading with his GPS and boundless enthusiasm, Tom cracking jokes to fill any silence, Sarah documenting everything, Lisa keeping pace while mentally cataloging potential hazards. The trail wound through dense stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, their branches forming a canopy so thick that midday felt like dusk. It was Tom who first mentioned the smell. Anyone else notice that? He asked, wrinkling his nose as we stopped for lunch beside a small stream. Smells like, I don't know, something died. I caught it too, a cloying, sweet odor that seemed to drift in and out on the breeze. Lisa, ever practical, suggested it was probably just decomposing vegetation. Lots of organic matter in old-growth forests, she said, unwrapping her sandwich. Nothing to worry about. But the smell followed us. Hour after hour, it would fade and return, always just strong enough to notice, never strong enough to locate. By late afternoon, when we should have reached our planned campsite, we were all on edge. GPS says we should be there, Jake announced, frowning at the device in his palm. But I don't see any clearing. The trail had grown increasingly faint, branching and rejoining itself in patterns that made no sense. What should have been a well-marked path to a designated camping area had devolved into a maze of game trails and deer paths. Let's just pick a spot, Tom suggested. Flat ground, water source nearby. Same difference, right? We found a small clearing perhaps 50 yards from the main trail, if what we'd been following could still be called that. The space felt wrong somehow. Too perfectly circular, the grass too uniform, the surrounding trees standing at attention like silent sentinels. But the light was failing, and we were tired. As we set up camp, I noticed Sarah had gone quiet. She was still taking pictures, but mechanically now, without her usual artistic eye. When I asked what was wrong, she just shook her head. Something about this place, she said. The light's all wrong. Look at your shadow. I glanced down and felt my stomach twist. My shadow fell toward the setting sun instead of away from it, as if the light were coming from the wrong direction entirely. Optical illusion, Lisa said firmly, but I caught the uncertainty in her voice. Dense canopy, reflected light. Happens all the time in forests. That night, we built our fire in the center of the clearing and arranged our tents in a circle around it. The flames burned strangely, sometimes blue-white, sometimes deep orange, sometimes barely visible at all despite the constant crackle of burning wood. Every time we tried to discuss it, the conversation died, as if the words themselves were being swallowed by the darkness beyond our small circle of light. It was past midnight when the whispering started. At first, I thought it was wind in the trees, but the air was perfectly still, our tent walls hanging slack. The sound was human, dozens of voices speaking in hushed tones just beyond the range of comprehension. I lay in my sleeping bag, straining to make out words that seemed to shift and change the moment I focused on them. "Do you hear that?" Tom's voice drifted from the tent beside mine. "Hear what?" Lisa called back, but her tone suggested she heard it too. The whispering continued until dawn, rising and falling like waves against a distant shore. None of us slept well. When I finally emerged from my tent, haggard and exhausted, I found the others looking equally hollow-eyed. "Bad dreams," Jake muttered, poking at the cold ashes of our fire. "Kept dreaming about, I don't know, things in the trees." Sarah was already packing her camera equipment with jerky, urgent movements. "We need to leave," she said. "Right now." But when we tried to retrace our steps, the trail had vanished. Not faded, vanished. Where we had entered the clearing, there was now an impenetrable wall of thorns and deadfall that looked decades old. We spent 3 hours searching for another way out, but every direction led to the same result: more thorns, more deadfall, more reasons why we couldn't leave. "This is impossible," Lisa said, her medical training warring with evidence her eyes couldn't dismiss. "Terrain doesn't just change overnight." Tom laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Maybe we're just lost. Happens to the best of us, right?" We tried the GPS again. The device showed our location as a blank space. Not unmarked terrain, but literally nothing, as if we had stepped off the edge of the mapped world. By the second night, the dynamic of our group had shifted. Jake had withdrawn into himself, constantly checking and rechecking his compass as if the needle might suddenly start pointing in a sensible direction. Tom's optimism had curdled into something manic and forced. Lisa maintained her clinical composure, but I caught her muttering under her breath. Prayers, maybe, or medical mantras. And Sarah. Sarah had started talking to her camera. I first noticed it during dinner when she held the device up to her face and whispered, "Do you see them too?" When I asked who she meant, she just smiled and turned the camera toward the tree line. "Look at the pictures," she said, thumbing through the digital display. "Really look." I leaned in close, squinting at the small screen. The photos showed our campsite, our faces, the surrounding forest. But in every image, almost hidden in the shadows between trees, were shapes that shouldn't have been there. Tall, impossibly thin figures that seemed to blend with the bark and branches until you looked directly at them. "Photo artifacts," Lisa said quickly. "Digital noise, lens flares. There's a scientific explanation." But her hands were shaking as she spoke. The third night brought snow, which was impossible given the elevation and season. The flakes fell upward, drifting from the ground toward the sky in lazy spirals that hurt to watch. Our fire burned cold, giving off no heat despite the vigorous flames. And the whispering had changed. Now we could hear our names. Michael, Sarah, Tom, Lisa, Jake. The voices came from everywhere and nowhere, speaking in tones of longing and hunger. They knew things about us. Childhood fears, secret shames, the dreams we'd never shared with anyone. They whispered about my father's disappointment, about Sarah's failed relationships, about Tom's gambling problem, about Lisa's guilt over the patient she couldn't save, about Jake's recurring nightmares of drowning. "How do they know?" Tom asked, his voice cracking. "How the hell do they know about Vegas?" I didn't have an answer. None of us did. By dawn, Jake was gone. His tent remained fully zipped from the outside, his sleeping bag still warm to the touch. But inside, we found only his clothes, neatly folded as if he had simply evaporated out of them. His boots sat beside the tent flap, laces still tied. "People don't just disappear," Lisa said, but she was examining the sleeping bag with the intensity of a forensic investigator. There has to be an explanation. We searched the clearing, the surrounding forest, anywhere we could reach without losing sight of camp. No tracks, no signs of struggle, no indication that Jake had ever existed except for the clothes he'd left behind. That evening, he came back. I was gathering firewood when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, expecting to see Tom or one of the others, and instead found Jake walking toward me through the trees. He was naked, his skin pale and waxy in the fading light, his movements too fluid, too graceful. "Jake?" I called. "Jesus, man, where have you been? We've been looking everywhere." He smiled, but it was wrong. Too wide, held too long, as if he had forgotten how human expressions were supposed to work. When he spoke, his voice was his own, but layered with harmonics that made my teeth ache. "I went for a walk," he said. "Such beautiful country out here. So many interesting residents." I backed away slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. This thing looked like Jake, moved like Jake, but everything about it felt fundamentally wrong. When it blinked, the eyelids closed horizontally instead of vertically. "Where are your clothes?" I managed. The Jake thing tilted its head at an angle that should have broken vertebrae. "I don't need them anymore. None of us will." I ran. Back at camp, the others were huddled around the fire, their faces tight with fear. When I burst into the clearing, gasping and wild-eyed, they looked up with expressions of relief that quickly turned to horror. "Where's Jake?" Sarah asked. "He's coming," I said. "But it's not him. It's wearing his face, but it's not him." Tom laughed nervously. "Come on, Mike. You're freaking out. Jake probably just went for a swim or something." But Lisa was already moving, pulling medical supplies from her pack with swift, practiced motions. If someone's hurt or hypothermic, we need to be ready. The Jake thing emerged from the tree line moments later, still naked, still smiling that too wide smile. It moved with predatory grace, its skin seeming to shift and ripple in the firelight. "Hello, friends," it said in Jake's voice. "Miss me?" Sarah raised her camera and took a picture. The flash illuminated the clearing for a split second, and in that instant of stark white light, I saw what the camera saw. Not Jake, but something else entirely. Something with too many joints, too many teeth, eyes that reflected light like a nocturnal animal's. The thing that wore Jake's face lunged. Tom was closest. The creature moved faster than anything human-sized should have been able to move, covering 10 feet in what seemed like a single bound. Tom's scream cut off abruptly as elongated fingers wrapped around his throat. Lisa struck with her scalpel, the blade flashing silver in the firelight. The creature released Tom and whirled toward her, moving with that same impossible fluid motion. Where the blade had cut, no blood flowed, only a thick, dark substance that seemed to absorb light. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm. "Now!" We scattered into the forest, leaving behind our fire, our supplies, our hope of survival. Behind us, I could hear Tom screaming, a sound that went on far too long for someone with a human throat. Sarah and I crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at our clothes and skin. The darkness was absolute beneath the canopy, broken only by brief glimpses of stars through gaps in the leaves. We ran until our lungs burned, until our legs gave out, until we collapsed beside a fallen log in a small depression between hills. "What was that thing?" Sarah gasped. I didn't answer because I didn't know. The rational part of my mind insisted it had to be some kind of hallucination, a shared psychotic break brought on by stress and isolation. But I could still hear Tom screaming in the distance, a sound that rose and fell like music. We waited in the depression until dawn, huddled together for warmth, jumping at every sound. When pale light finally filtered through the trees, we saw that we were in a completely different part of the forest. Older trees, different terrain, stone formations I didn't recognize. "Where are we?" Sarah whispered. I checked my compass. The needle spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. My watch had stopped at 3:33, though I couldn't remember when. The GPS was dead, its screen dark despite a full battery the night before. That's when we heard Lisa calling our names. Her voice drifted through the trees, clear and desperate. "Michael! Sarah! Please, I found a way out! I found the trail!" Sarah started to stand, but I grabbed her arm. "No," I said. "Listen to her voice." Sarah cocked her head, and I saw understanding dawn in her eyes. Lisa's voice was calling from 3 different directions at once, the words perfectly synchronized but coming from separate sources, and underneath the familiar tone was something else, the same harmonics I'd heard when the Jake thing spoke. "They're all gone," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "Tom, Jake, Lisa, it got all of them." We moved deeper into the forest, away from the voices. But everywhere we went, we heard our friends calling. Sometimes it was Jake's voice, cheerful and encouraging. Sometimes Tom, making jokes about getting lost. Sometimes Lisa, offering medical advice and practical solutions. Always from multiple directions, always with those wrong harmonics underneath. By midday, Sarah was talking to her camera again. "They're in the pictures," she said, scrolling through image after image. "All of them, but they're different now. Changed." I looked at the display and felt my sanity crack a little more. The photos showed our friends, but wrong. Jake with eyes that were too large and completely black, Tom with a mouth that split his face from ear to ear, Lisa with fingers that bent the wrong way. "We have to destroy the camera," I said. "No." Sarah clutched the device to her chest. "It's the only proof. The only way anyone will believe us." But as she spoke, I could see the thing that had been Lisa approaching through the trees behind her. It moved with Lisa's measured gait but left no footprints in the soft earth. Its face was Lisa's face, but the skin was too tight, as if it were a mask that didn't quite fit. "Sarah," I said quietly, "don't turn around." The Lisa thing spoke in Lisa's voice. "Sarah, Michael, thank God I found you. I've been looking everywhere. Tom and Jake are hurt. They need medical attention." Sarah began to turn despite my warning, but I tackled her, knocking the camera from her hands. It hit the ground and shattered, the LCD screen fragmenting into a spiderweb of broken light. "No!" Sarah screamed, lunging for the pieces. "My pictures! The proof!" The Lisa thing stopped pretending to be human. Its face peeled back like old wallpaper, revealing something underneath that my mind refused to process. It made a sound, not quite a roar, not quite a scream, but something that seemed to come from inside my own skull. We ran again. For 3 days, we played a deadly game of hide-and-seek through the forest. The things that had been our friends hunted us with patient persistence, calling our names, promising safety, offering explanations that almost made sense. They knew our voices, our mannerisms, our fears. They used them against us. Sarah grew weaker by the hour. Without her camera, she seemed lost, constantly reaching for the device that was no longer there. She talked to herself in fragments, reciting technical specifications and exposure settings like a mantra. F-stop 2.8, shutter speed 1/60th, ISO 400, she would mutter. Capture the moment. Always capture the moment. On the 4th night, I lost her too. I woke to find her sleeping bag empty, unzipped from the inside just like Jake's had been. But this time, I knew where she had gone. I could hear her voice in the distance, joining the chorus of our dead friends. "Michael, Michael, come home, Michael." For 2 more days, I wandered alone through the forest that wasn't a forest, pursued by voices that wore familiar faces. I ate berries that turned to ash in my mouth and drank from streams that tasted of copper and despair. My compass spun, my watch remained frozen, and the GPS showed only static. It was on the 7th day that I found the real trail. Not the path we had followed into this nightmare, but an actual, maintained hiking trail with proper markers and blazes. It appeared suddenly, as if someone had drawn it into existence while I wasn't looking. At first, I thought it was another trap, another false hope designed to lure me deeper into the maze. but the voices of my friends grew fainter as I followed it, and for the first time in a week, I felt something approaching genuine hope. The trail led steadily downhill, through forests that looked increasingly normal. Real shadows fell in the right directions. Real birds sang in the trees. My compass needle steadied, pointing toward actual magnetic north. After 6 hours of hiking, I stumbled out of the tree line and into the parking lot of a ranger station. The building was real, solid wood and stone, with working electricity and a radio that crackled with human voices. The ranger on duty, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and calloused hands, took one look at me and reached for her first aid kit. "Son, you look like you've been through hell," she said. "When did you last eat? When did you last see another person?" I tried to explain, but the words came out wrong. I told her about the camping trip, about my friends, about getting lost. But when I mentioned the things that had taken their faces, the whispering voices, the impossible geography, I could see doubt creeping into her expression. "You've been missing for 3 weeks," she said gently. "Your friends reported you overdue when you didn't return to Boise. We've had search and rescue teams out looking for you." 3 weeks? I had counted 7 days. "My friends?" I asked. "Jake Morrison, Sarah Rodriguez, Tom Baker, Lisa Gonzalez?" The ranger consulted a file on her desk. "They're the ones who reported you missing. They made it back on schedule but said you'd gotten separated from the group on the second day. They waited as long as they could, then hiked out to get help." I stared at her, my mouth dry as dust. "That's impossible. They were with me. They were taken. I saw what happened to them." She gave me the look medical professionals reserve for patients experiencing a psychotic break. "Son, you've been alone in the wilderness for 3 weeks. Dehydration, hypothermia, sleep deprivation. They can cause hallucinations, false memories. It's more common than you'd think. But I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced. And as she led me to the radio to call for medical evacuation, I caught sight of my reflection in the window. For just a moment, less than a heartbeat, my reflection smiled back at me with teeth that were too sharp and eyes that were too wide. I blinked, and it was just my own haggard face staring back. The helicopter arrived an hour later, piloted by a man who introduced himself as Jake Morrison. He had Jake's voice, Jake's mannerisms, Jake's easy smile. But when he helped me into the aircraft, his hands were cold as winter stone. "Good to see you again, buddy," he said as we lifted off. "We were really worried about you." Through the headset, I could hear other voices. Sarah providing location coordinates, Tom cracking jokes about my appearance, Lisa offering medical advice for my care. All of them speaking in perfect unison, all of them using the same harmonics I had learned to fear. As we flew over the Sawtooth Wilderness, I looked down and saw the Whispering Pines Trail marked clearly on the landscape below. It formed a perfect spiral, twisting inward toward a dark center where no trees grew. And in that center, I could see tiny figures moving, new hikers, new victims, following the path that led nowhere and everywhere at once. "Don't worry," the thing wearing Jake's face said over the intercom. "We'll take good care of you. Forever and always." The helicopter banked toward Boise, carrying me home to a life where I would always be watched, always be monitored, always be surrounded by friends who weren't quite right, where I would smile and laugh and pretend not to notice when their shadows fell the wrong way, when their reflections lagged a heartbeat behind their movements, when they spoke in perfect harmony without meaning to, where I would wait for the day when some other lost hiker would stumble out of the wilderness, babbling about whispering voices and stolen faces, and I would look at them with kind eyes and offer reasonable explanations for the impossible things they had seen. After all, that's what friends are for. The Whispering Pines Trail remains on the maps, marked as a scenic 12-mile hike through old-growth forest. Park rangers report no unusual incidents, and the few hikers who do attempt the trail return with glowing reviews of the untouched wilderness and excellent camping opportunities. But sometimes, late at night when the wind is still, You can hear voices calling from the mountains. Familiar voices, speaking familiar names, offering friendship to anyone brave enough to answer. They're always looking for new friends. And they're always hungry.